He ran South Korea's most feared criminal empire, and a 3-year-old girl with a paintbrush brought him to his knees. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when the most dangerous man in the country gets watercolor flowers painted on his face while he sleeps, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Max. The night Kang Tae-hyun watched his third trusted lieutenant die, it was raining so hard the mountains outside Seoul had disappeared entirely behind a wall of gray water. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his estate, a sprawling structure of dark stone and reinforced glass built into the ridge of Bukhansan's southern face like a scar that wouldn't close. And he watched the blood run thin across the marble floor of his own dining room, while his security chief, Park Dong-soo, stood 6 feet away with a pistol still warm in his hand. The man on the floor had been with Tae-hyun for 9 years. His name was Lee Byung-chul, and he was 41 years old, and he had a daughter in Busan who didn't know her father worked for the Jong-il syndicate. He had been skimming from the Eastern port accounts for 11 months. Not a lot. Just enough to think he was being careful. Just enough to think he wouldn't get caught. He got caught. Tae-hyun didn't look at the body. He kept his eyes on the rain. "Clean it," he said. Dong-soo holstered the weapon without a word. He'd been doing this for 12 years. He didn't need instructions. Tae-hyun lifted his glass of whiskey. Japanese, aged 21 years, the kind of bottle that cost more than Lee Byung-chul had managed to steal in all 11 months of careful skimming. And he finished what was left in 3 slow swallows. He set the glass down on the windowsill without a sound. He turned and walked out of the dining room without looking at the floor. In the hallway outside, 2 of his men stood at attention, young, both under 25, both staring straight ahead the way they'd been trained, which meant they'd heard everything and were now working very hard to look like they hadn't. Tae-hyun stopped walking. He looked at the one on the left, Kim Jae-won, 23 years old, 2 years in the organization, good with numbers. His mother worked at a bakery in Mapogu, and every Friday without fail, Jae-won sent half his pay home before he spent a single one on himself. Tae-hyun knew this because Tae-hyun knew everything about every person inside his walls. "You knew," Tae-hyun said quietly. Not a question. Jae-won's throat moved. "Sir, he was your section head. The accounts went through your terminal first." Tae-hyun's voice had no temperature in it. "You knew for how long?" The young man's jaw locked up. His hands were flat against his thighs, but the tendons in his forearms were standing out like cables under skin. He was terrified and working hard to hide it and failing in exactly the small ways that Tae-hyun had spent 32 years learning to read. 2 months, Jae-won said finally. "I knew for 2 months." Tae-hyun nodded once. He looked at him for another 3 seconds, long enough to feel like a full minute. And then he continued walking down the hall. "Transfer him to the Incheon warehouse," he said to Dong-soo without looking back. "Night shifts, inventory only, no access to accounts for 18 months. He heard Dong-soo's quiet acknowledgement behind him. He walked to his office, closed the door, sat down in the leather chair behind his desk, and put his face in his hands. Not grief, not guilt, just exhaustion. A specific kind of exhaustion that had no cure and no bottom, the kind that came from living inside a world where every single relationship had a price tag attached to it, and the only question was whether you found the price tag before or after it cost you something you couldn't get back. Lee Byung-chul had a daughter in Busan. Tae-hyun stared at the wall for a long time, thinking about that. Then he pulled the quarterly accounts across his desk and got back to work. He had built the Jong-il syndicate on the architecture of his own survival instinct, which was considerable, and on the ruins of the organization his father had run before a rival faction put 3 bullets in the old man's chest in a parking garage in Gangnam when Tae-hyun was 19 years old. The name Jong-il had been his father's, a reference to the concept of righteousness and integrity, which had always struck Tae-hyun as the kind of ironic joke that the universe liked to leave unremarked upon. His father, Kang Seong-il, had been neither righteous nor particularly integral, but he had been efficient, and he had been feared, and he had been careful, right up until the moment he wasn't. He'd trusted a man named Oh Sung-jae with information that could have burned the whole organization to the ground, and Oh Sung-jae had sold it to 3 competing families simultaneously before vanishing to Osaka with enough money to buy a new face. Taehyun had spent the next 4 years rebuilding. He had not made his father's mistake. He did not give anyone information that could be used against him. He did not give anyone loyalty that hadn't been earned through years of demonstrated utility. He tested every person who came into his organization. Small traps, carefully laid, transparent enough that someone paying attention might notice, but subtle enough that most people didn't. The ones who passed stayed. The ones who failed disappeared or ended up in inventory management in Incheon, depending on the degree of the failure. He was feared across 3 provinces and respected in ways that mattered more than fear in the capital. Legitimate businesses ran as cover, a construction firm, a chain of high-end restaurants, a shipping company with routes through Busan, Incheon, and Jeju. The politicians who took his money were careful about it, and the ones who hadn't taken it yet were being handled. He had standing arrangements with 2 major police precincts that cost him enough annually to make him grimace every time he reviewed the figures, but which had kept 3 different investigations from going anywhere useful. He had absolute control. He had not genuinely laughed in 4 years. He had not let anyone inside his house without having them vetted by Dong-soo and 2 additional background screening processes first. He had not allowed a personal conversation that wasn't tactical in nature. He ate alone when possible, slept 4 to 5 hours a night, and had learned somewhere in his late 20s that the kind of loneliness he lived with was simply the cost of the life he'd chosen, and that the sooner you accepted that cost without flinching, the more effective you became. He had accepted it. He was very effective. The housekeeper situation started as an inconvenience and became something else entirely, though he wouldn't understand what it had become until much later. His previous domestic staff had been managed by a woman named Mrs. Han, who had run the household operations with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years making herself invisible to powerful men and had turned invisibility into a kind of art form. She left in October. Her husband had retired, they were moving to Jeju, and the agency sent 3 replacements over the course of 2 weeks, all of whom had either failed Dong-soo's background screening or lasted 48 hours before deciding that the atmosphere of the estate was not something they wanted to be inside of indefinitely. Taehyun noted this without much concern. He had contingency staff. The house functioned. On the 3rd Monday of November, the agency sent Naomi Brooks. Dong-soo brought the file to Taehyun's office the evening before she was scheduled to start. Standard procedure, new household staff, complete profile review before first entry. Taehyun read it at his desk while the rain worked itself up outside. Naomi Alicia Brooks, 33 years old, African-American, born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. Educational background, associate degree in hospitality management, certified in domestic services and private household management through an accredited program in Seoul. Arrived in South Korea 14 months ago on a work visa. Single mother. 1 dependent, Zuri Amara Brooks, age 3. Previous employment in Seoul. 2 private household positions, both verified satisfactory. References strong. No criminal record anywhere. Finances, and here Taehyun paused, because the finances told a story the rest of the file didn't, were precarious in the specific way that indicated someone operating without a safety net of any kind. She was making it work, but barely, and the math was tight enough that a single unexpected expense would break it. He noted that she'd relocated to South Korea following what the background notes diplomatically described as significant personal and financial disruption in Atlanta. The specifics weren't in the file. They didn't need to be. Taehyun had read enough of these documents to recognize the outline of a life that had been taken apart and was being rebuilt by someone who had no option but to rebuild it. She checked clean? He asked. Yes, sir. Clean on everything. Dong-soo paused. The child... There's no registered child care arrangement on file. I flagged it. She may have informal arrangements. That's her problem, Taehyun said, handing the file back. 6-day schedule. Standard terms. She starts tomorrow. Naomi Brooks arrived at 7:40 a.m., which was 20 minutes early, which Taehyun noted from his office window as she came through the gate. She was tall, moved with her shoulders squared back in a way that looked less like confidence and more like someone who had decided a long time ago that she was going to look like she belonged wherever she was, regardless of what she was feeling underneath. She wore a dark gray coat and sensible shoes and carried a bag over one shoulder. She spoke briefly with the gate security, showed her credentials without being asked twice, and walked up the entry path at a steady pace. He watched her for 11 seconds and then went back to his documents. The first week passed without incident. Naomi learned the house quickly, the routines, the specific standards for each room, the way certain things were always done in a particular order for reasons that were never explained and that she never asked about. He saw her twice in passing. She greeted him with appropriate professional deference and got out of his way. She was efficient and she didn't make herself noticed, which was exactly what the position required. He didn't think about her at all outside of those two brief interactions. On the morning of the 8th day, Dong-soo appeared in the doorway of his study with an expression Tae-hyun had learned to identify as specifically unpleasant news being delivered with studied neutrality. "There's a situation," Dong-soo said. "Define situation." "Miss Brooks is at the gate. She has the child with her." Tae-hyun set his pen down. "Her childcare arrangement fell through this morning," Dong-soo continued. "She called ahead about 20 minutes ago when she realized she had no alternative. I flagged it for you before responding." "She called to ask permission." "Yes." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd relay the message." Tae-hyun looked at the desk. His schedule for the morning: 2 internal briefings, a phone consultation with the Busan shipping managers, review of the amended contract structures from the Eastern port accounts that still needed to be restructured following Lee Byung-chul's removal. No external visitors. No sensitive materials moving through public areas. A 3-year-old in his house. He thought about Dong-soo's face when he'd said it. The careful blankness that meant Dong-soo thought this was a bad idea and had already decided not to say so. "Let them in," Tae-hyun said. Dong-soo's face didn't move. "Sir, it's 1 day. Tell her the child stays in the west sitting room. She doesn't go in the north wing. She doesn't go above the ground floor. She doesn't leave that room without Miss Brooks." "Understood." Tae-hyun picked his pen back up. "And Dong-soo?" "Sir, don't make it more complicated than it is." He heard her before he saw her. He was in the middle of the Busan phone consultation, standing at his desk reviewing shipping manifests, when a sound came through the closed door of his office, high and clear, and utterly incongruous with every other sound the house usually contained. Not crying, not distress. Something between a hum and a song, half remembered and half invented, the way very small children sang when they were focused on something and didn't know anyone was listening. He stopped talking. On the other end of the line, his Busan manager kept going for another sentence before noticing the silence. "Sir?" "Hold on," Tae-hyun said. He listened. The sound was coming from the west sitting room, which shared a wall with the corridor outside his office. Small voice, aimless melody, completely at home in a house that had not contained anything resembling that sound in a very long time. He stood there for 4 seconds before he realized what he was doing and why. "Continue," he said into the phone. He finished the call 18 minutes later. He did not get up from his desk. He did not walk out into the corridor. He did not do anything except work through the rest of his morning schedule in the ordinary way. And if he noticed that the humming had stopped around midday and felt the absence of it as a specific kind of quiet that was different from the ordinary silence of the house, he didn't acknowledge it, even to himself. The second time Zuri Brooks came to the house was 4 days later, and the third time was 2 days after that. The childcare situation, it turned out, was genuinely unstable. A neighbor who watched the girl while Naomi worked, an informal arrangement that kept breaking down without warning, leaving Naomi with no fallback. She asked permission each time. She was always early. She always called ahead. Tae-hyun authorized each visit through Dong-soo without comment. By the third visit, the routine was already establishing itself. Zuri arrived with a backpack that Tae-hyun could now identify from a distance, bright red with a cartoon giraffe on the front panel, and she went straight to the west sitting room and unpacked it with a seriousness that seemed disproportionate to her size. Crayons in a wooden case, a set of watercolor paints in a flat tin, a thick pad of paper, the stuffed giraffe, which rode in the backpack's outer pocket with its long neck sticking out like a passenger. She didn't explore the house. She didn't touch anything she wasn't supposed to. She set up her materials with the focused industry of a much older person settling into a workspace, and then she painted. Taehyun knew this because, on the third visit, and then the fourth, and then the fifth, he found reasons to walk past the west sitting room, not to interact with her, not deliberately. The hallway ran past the sitting room on the way between his office and the East Wing consultation room, and that route was functionally necessary on several occasions each morning. If he walked it slightly more slowly than usual, or if he paused in passing to observe what was visible through the half-open door, a small figure, cross-legged on the floor, brush in hand, tongue slightly out in concentration, painting something that was unmistakably a butterfly, that was incidental to the practical requirements of moving from one part of the house to another. He told himself this with the same straight face he gave everyone else. On the fifth visit, he walked past at a moment when Naomi was out of the room. She'd gone to the kitchen, he knew from the sound, and the little girl looked up from her painting and saw him. She did not startle, did not shrink, did not react the way that adults in his presence almost universally reacted, which was some variation of immediate, physically perceptible tension. She looked at him with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet been taught to read a room, and then she said, "Do you want to see?" He stopped walking. He had not intended to stop walking. His body stopped anyway. She was holding up the pad of paper, tilting it toward him with both hands, the way a child holds something out when they want an adult to approve of it. The painting was of a butterfly, orange and black, with irregular wings that were slightly different sizes, which only made them look more like actual butterfly wings. In the background was what appeared to be a very round yellow sun and several blue blobs that might have been clouds. Taehyun looked at it. "It's a monarch," Zuri said. "They fly a really long way." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I know what a monarch is," he said. She considered this seriously. "My teacher says they go all the way to Mexico. That's really far." "It is." She lowered the pad and looked at him with that same direct, unfiltered attention. "You have tired eyes," she said. Something in his chest did a strange thing that he couldn't immediately categorize. "Go back to your painting," he said, and walked away down the corridor. He did not slow down again, but the first time he left something for her was on a Wednesday in late November, in the second week of the arrangement. He had been reviewing documents in his office for 6 hours straight. The morning consultations had run long. A dispute with the Incheon faction over distribution territory that should have been settled in 40 minutes had stretched to 3 hours because Min Jun-ho, the Incheon underboss, was being deliberately obtuse about jurisdictional lines that had been drawn years ago and were not in dispute except in Min's ambitious and consistently inconvenient imagination. Taehyun had remained calm throughout. He was always calm. Remaining calm while making it absolutely clear that the outcome of the conversation was not in question, regardless of how long Min wanted to pretend otherwise, was one of the more refined tools in a well-stocked arsenal, and he'd been using it since his early 20s. But by the time Min finally stopped talking and agreed to the terms that had been the only available terms since the beginning of the conversation, Taehyun was tired in the deep tissue way that hours of controlled composure produced. He walked out of the consultation room and down the corridor toward his office. And as he passed the west sitting room, he heard Zuri's voice inside, in the middle of what appeared to be a serious conversation with the stuffed giraffe about the relative merits of green paint versus blue paint. He stopped without meaning to. "But blue is better for sky," she was explaining earnestly. "Green is for grass. You can't make sky out of grass color." A pause, presumably for the giraffe's counter-argument. "No," she said firmly. "You can't. It doesn't work that way." Taehyun stood in the corridor for a moment, just outside the door. Then he turned and walked to the kitchen. There was apple juice in the refrigerator, a small bottle, the kind with a foil top that peeled back. He took it to the west sitting room, walked inside, set it on the low table beside Zuri's painting materials without comment, and walked back out. Zuri looked up at the bottle. Then she looked at the door. "Thank you," she called after him. He was already at the end of the corridor. He didn't respond. He went into his office, sat down at his desk, and felt, for approximately 15 seconds before he shut it down and redirected his attention, something that felt dangerously close to the specific warmth of being useful to someone in a way that had nothing to do with fear or obligation. He shut it down. He picked up the Busan shipping manifests. He worked until midnight. Quote, the fourth week was when Naomi began to exist to him as a person rather than a function. It happened in pieces, which was how most true things happened, not in a single revelatory moment, but in accumulation, small detail by small detail, until the total weight of the accumulated details became impossible to pretend wasn't there. He noticed that she worked past her scheduled hours on Tuesdays without being asked to, because Tuesdays were when the household's weekly supply order came in and needed to be inventoried and stored, and the previous system for managing the inventory had been inefficient. She'd restructured it without announcement. He noticed because the quarterly supply variance report, which Dong-soo compiled and Tae-hyun reviewed, suddenly showed a 12% reduction in waste across household consumables. And when he asked Dong-soo about it, Dong-soo said Ms. Brooks had revised the storage rotation. He noticed that she spoke to his guards the way she spoke to everyone else, not with the particular performing down the hierarchy warmth that some household staff used as a social survival strategy, but with straightforward courtesy that didn't calibrate itself to the rank of whoever she was talking to. His guards, who were young men trained to be suspicious of social niceties, seemed to find this both puzzling and quietly disarming. He noticed that she never asked questions about the parts of the house she didn't have access to, and never reacted to the things she must have noticed. The security personnel, the late-night arrivals of men she'd never be introduced to, the rooms that were always locked, the general atmosphere of a house that was also, without any public acknowledgement, something other than a house. She was not naive. He was certain of that. She'd noticed. She understood at some level what she was working inside. She had simply made a decision to do her job, to not ask questions, to be professional about the reality of her situation. And she was executing that decision with a consistency that he found, despite himself, genuinely admirable. On the Thursday evening of the fourth week, he stayed later than usual in the East Wing reviewing contracts, and when he finally came out into the main corridor at 7 in the evening, Naomi was still there, not working, but sitting in the corridor outside the west sitting room with her back against the wall and Zuri asleep in her lap, the child's face turned into her mother's side, both of them still. Tae-hyun stopped at the end of the corridor. Naomi looked up. She started to move, to stand, to apologize, to manage the situation, and he raised one hand. "Don't wake her," he said. She stilled. He looked at the two of them in the corridor for a moment, the tired woman with her child asleep in her lap, in the hallway of a house that belonged to a man with people buried in the foundation of his reputation. And then he said, "The car will be ready in an hour. Take the guest room at the East End until she wakes." Naomi looked at him, not with the automatic professional gratitude he might have expected. She looked at him with an expression that was measuring something, figuring out whether the offer was genuine, whether there was a cost attached, whether she could accept it without creating a dynamic she wasn't equipped to navigate. "No obligation," he said, which was as close to emotional transparency as he ever got in the normal run of things. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and walked in the other direction. He did not analyze the 15 extra minutes it took him to walk back to his own office, because the route he took passed the guest room at the East End twice. The night that changed everything began at 9 in the evening and did not end until nearly 4 in the morning. It started as a meeting, a truce negotiation between the Gyeongil Syndicate and the Park family, who controlled the Western distribution networks out of Gyeonggi Province and had been in a state of managed hostility with Taehyun's organization for 7 years. The Park family had finally blinked, reached out through intermediaries, proposed terms, agreed to a neutral location. The neutral location was Taehyun's estate. This was by design. The meeting on his ground forced the park representatives to accept the psychological architecture of his environment, the guards, the silence, the careful precision of how every element of the space communicated authority. They came in knowing they were already behind. The Park family sent 3 representatives. Their lead was a man named Park Sung-min, 54 years old, with the kind of careful politeness that functioned as a weapon in the hands of someone who'd been negotiating from positions of weakness long enough to perfect the art. He was good. He was patient. He came prepared to spend hours on terms that Taehyun had already decided in advance. Taehyun spent 7 hours being more patient. By the time the final terms were signed, distribution territories redrawn, revenue splits formalized, Penalties for breach stipulated in language specific enough that no one could pretend ambiguity later. It was 3:47 a.m. Dong-Su escorted the park representatives out. The legal staff finished their paperwork. The guard stood down from the elevated alert that had governed the property all night. Taehyun sat alone in the main sitting room with the signed documents in front of him and felt the full weight of 7 hours of controlled performance descend on him all at once. He was exhausted in the specific way that came from maintaining absolute composure across an extended period while every instinct in his body was running in the background at maximum intensity, reading faces, tracking micro-expressions, calculating leverage, anticipating moves 3 exchanges ahead. It was a particular kind of depletion that sleep could fix but not immediately, and that alcohol made temporarily pleasant without actually addressing. He didn't reach for the whiskey. He sat back in the chair with the documents on the table and let his eyes close for just a moment. Just a moment. The light in the room was different when he became aware of it again. Morning light, gray, the way November mornings were gray in the mountains, diffuse and flat, coming in through the east-facing windows. He blinked once, twice, and the room assembled itself around him. Same chair, same table, documents still exactly where he'd left them. His body ached in the specific places that hours in a chair produced. He had not moved in approximately 5 hours. He heard something, very close. A sound, small, focused, the precise controlled movement of something being drawn across paper, light, and repeated, like a brush. He did not open his eyes immediately. He was aware, with a certainty that bypassed the usual analytical process and landed directly in whatever part of him registered things without requiring explanation, that he was not afraid. The sound was not a threat. Whatever was happening within arm's reach of him was not dangerous. This was not a reasoned conclusion. It was a bodily certainty, immediate and absolute. He opened his eyes. The stuffed giraffe was sitting on the edge of the table 18 inches from his face, propped upright, watching him with button eyes. 6 inches to the left of the giraffe, Zuri Brooks was kneeling on the cushion of the adjacent chair with a watercolor brush in her hand, and she was, with extreme concentration, with the full and undivided attention of a 3-year-old who had found something worthy of her complete artistic focus, painting his face. He felt it now, with full waking consciousness, the slight cool dampness across his left cheekbone, the gentle repeated pressure of the brush against his forehead. She was not being careless. She was being careful, in the particular way of a child who was doing something she understood to be important. He lay perfectly still, not from calculation, not from strategy. He simply lay still because the moment was so unexpected, so outside the entire grammar of his life, that his body didn't have an automatic response to it. Zuri didn't notice he was awake, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. She dipped her brush, considered the color, blue, and made 3 careful strokes across his forehead. He watched her face. She was beautiful in the way that small children were beautiful, not with any of the complexity or effort that beauty required in adults, but simply, entirely, the way a thing that was itself was beautiful. Her brow was slightly furrowed with focus. Her lower lip was out. She was utterly, completely absorbed in what she was doing. "What are you painting?" he said, very quietly. She did not startle. She looked at him, not with the panicked recognition of someone caught doing something wrong, but with the matter-of-fact directness he had come to recognize as specifically hers. "You looked lonely while you were sleeping," she said, "so I'm giving you butterflies." The room was very still. Taehyun did not move. Something was happening in his chest, an opening, slow and involuntary, the kind that happened to structures when they'd been under pressure for too long and something gave way. He could not have named it. He would not have tried. He simply felt it happening, the way you feel something massive begin to move in the dark. "So I'm giving you butterflies," Zuri said again, to clarify, dipping her brush. He heard the door. Naomi Brooks came into the room carrying a cup of coffee in one hand and a small dish in the other. She'd been in the kitchen, he understood. She'd been gone perhaps 12 minutes. She'd come back to check on her daughter. And she stopped so completely and so suddenly in the doorway that the coffee tilted in the cup and some of it went across the dish. She looked at him. He looked at her. Zuri kept painting. The expression on Naomi's face cycled through approximately 4 stages in the space of 2 seconds. Confusion, comprehension, absolute terror. and then a composure that she deployed over the terror like a lid coming down over something that had to be contained. "Zuri?" Her voice was very controlled, very careful. "Put the brush down." "I'm not finished," Zuri said. "Zuri." The small girl looked at her mother and then looked at Tae-hyun, and then looked at the brush in her hand, and then, apparently reaching her own conclusion about the situation, set the brush carefully back in the tin. "Okay," she said, "I'm finished." Naomi crossed the room and crouched down beside her daughter, and took both the child's hands in both of hers and held them. And then she looked up at Tae-hyun, and he watched her gather herself, visibly, deliberately, into whatever she needed to be for this moment. "I'm sorry," she said. The words had weight in them, not performance, not the reflexive apology of someone minimizing a situation to preserve their position. The real kind. "I only stepped out for a few minutes. I should never have. I am so sorry." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, slowly, the kind of slowly that his body required after 5 hours in a chair, and he walked to the mirror on the east wall. He looked at himself. There was a yellow sun on his left cheekbone, a blue butterfly on his forehead, slightly asymmetrical, with wings that were different sizes in exactly the way that real butterfly wings were different sizes. Across his nose, a rainbow, red, orange, yellow, 3 colors. The green hadn't quite dried before it ran into the blue. Small orange dots along his jaw that he realized, after a moment, were freckles. On his chin, 1 small flower, pink, with a round center and 5 rounded petals. He stood there, and he looked at what a 3-year-old had put on the face of South Korea's most feared crime lord, and he felt the opening in his chest continue to widen, and then he felt, coming up through it, through the gap, from somewhere that had been sealed closed for a long time, something enormous and uncontrollable and completely uncharacteristic moving toward the surface. Behind him, Naomi was beginning a second, more detailed apology. He could hear her voice, controlled, professional, steady, working through the situation with the kind of careful precision of someone who understood that a single wrong word in the next 30 seconds could end her employment, her income, her carefully constructed life in this country, and who was therefore choosing every word with absolute deliberateness while also genuinely, deeply meaning them. He turned from the mirror. He looked at Naomi Brooks, who was watching him with the steadiness of a woman who had been through enough that she had learned to absorb whatever came at her without breaking, even when the not breaking required everything she had. He looked at Zuri Brooks, who was watching him with frank curiosity and no visible concern whatsoever, one hand on her stuffed giraffe. He opened his mouth. What came out was not what either of them expected. What came out was a laugh, sudden, involuntary, starting low and coming up fast and breaking out of him completely beyond his control. A laugh that had no performance in it, no calculation, no distance, nothing except the entirely unguarded sound of a man who had spent 4 years forgetting how to do this, and was now, without any preparation and without any intention, simply doing it in the middle of his own sitting room at 7 in the morning with a child's painting drying on his face. He laughed for a long time. Down the hall, outside the main doors, his 2 guards exchanged a look that neither of them would ever directly acknowledge. In 32 years, they had not heard that sound from this house. Bocho. He didn't wash his face. Dong-soo was the first one to see it, and he managed it by saying nothing at all, which was the correct response, and the one that Tae-hyun respected him for. The morning briefing happened with the rainbow still drying on the bridge of Tae-hyun's nose, and the butterfly still sitting blue and slightly asymmetrical across his forehead. His 3 senior underbosses, assembled by 8 a.m. for the weekly status review, sat across the conference table and maintained expressions of such studied and absolute neutrality that Tae-hyun could see the effort it was costing each of them individually, and he found this too deeply funny and did not allow himself to show it. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Business was conducted. Decisions were made. South Korea's most feared crime syndicate was steered through its weekly operational review by a man with orange freckles on his jaw and a small pink flower on his chin, and no one said a single word about it. After the meeting, one of the underbosses, the youngest, 29 years old, a man named Choi Jae-min, who had been with the organization for 3 years and had always pushed just slightly further than the others, stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. He said to the door frame, "The butterfly is a good one, sir." Then he walked out. Taehyun sat alone at the conference table for a moment. "Yeah," he said to the empty room. "It is." He sat there a moment longer, and then he went back to work. And somewhere in the West Wing, barely audible through 2 closed doors and 40 feet of corridor, he could hear a small voice talking to a stuffed giraffe about the proper technique for painting clouds. He left his office door open for the rest of the morning. He had never left it open before. Something had shifted. He could feel it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular certainty of something that had already happened and could not now be undone. The fortress was not demolished. Nothing that significant had changed. But somewhere in the walls of it, something had come loose. A crack, small, letting light in from an unexpected angle. He didn't know yet what that meant. He didn't know that Naomi Brooks, in the kitchen 2 wings away, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking, running through what had just happened with the careful, analytical precision of a woman who had learned to assess risk before it assessed her, was asking herself the exact same question. Neither of them noticed that the little girl had already answered it. She was painting again. Butterflies. Filling the page with them in orange and black and yellow, patient and methodical, pressing the brush lightly the way you pressed something when you wanted it to last. Outside, the November rain had finally stopped. The mountains came back. The week after the butterfly morning was the quietest Taehyun had known in years. And quiet, in his experience, was never actually quiet. It was always the surface tension of something that hadn't broken yet. He noticed it in the way his household moved differently. Not dramatically. The guards still ran their rotations with the same mechanical precision. Dong-soo still appeared in doorways with files and bad news delivered in the same neutral register. The house still functioned with the operational efficiency of a well-maintained machine. But his office door stayed open. He hadn't made a decision about that. It had simply continued being open the way something continues after it's been started. No further input required, momentum carrying it forward on its own. Dong-soo had noticed. Taehyun could tell because Dong-soo had not mentioned it, which was the specific version of noticing that meant he was watching it the way you watched something you weren't sure about yet. The open door let sound in. That was the material difference. The house had always been quiet in the way of controlled environments. The sounds that existed were intentional, managed, the sounds of a place run by someone who disliked ambient noise on principle. Now there was another layer underneath that quiet. Irregular. Unpredictable. Small. Zuri Brooks had started bringing a second stuffed animal. The giraffe had been joined by a small elephant, gray, with one floppy ear. The elephant's name, he had gathered from fragments of overheard conversation, was Gerald, which struck him as a strange name for an elephant, but he had not grown up naming stuffed animals, and so perhaps he lacked context. He heard her explaining Gerald's entire biographical history to the giraffe one Tuesday morning while he was on a call with Busan. Something about Gerald having recently recovered from an illness that had required him to rest for 3 days, which Taehyun gathered meant the elephant had been left in the backpack while Zuri painted without him, which had apparently been a medical necessity. He pressed mute on the Busan call for 40 seconds. He pressed it back. He concluded the call and sat at his desk for a moment after hanging up, aware that he was sitting there for no clear operational reason, and then he picked up the next document and got back to work. The problem arrived on a Friday, which was how problems usually arrived, at the end of something, when your guard was lowest. His name was Min Jun-ho, the Incheon underboss, and he arrived at the estate at 11 in the morning without an appointment, which was itself an act of calculated aggression that Taehyun recognized immediately and filed. Min was 50 years old, compact, with the dense stillness of a man who had survived long enough in this world that survival itself had become a personality trait. He wore expensive clothes that he wore wrong, not with the ease of someone who'd grown up around money, but with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd acquired money and was now performing it, which meant he still thought about what he was wearing, which meant there was still something underneath the performance that the performance was covering. Taehyun had known Min for 11 years. He had never trusted him for a single day of those 11 years, which was simply accurate risk assessment rather than personal dislike, though he found, if he was honest, that he also personally disliked him. He received him in the East Wing consultation room, not the main sitting room, not the office, The consultation room, which communicated availability without warmth and business without welcome. Dong-su stood at the door. Sit, Tae-hyun said. Min sat. He looked comfortable, which was the one thing he absolutely wasn't, and they both knew it. I'll skip the part where you explain why you're here without a scheduled meeting, Tae-hyun said. Get to the actual thing. Min's face moved in a way that might have been a smile on someone else. I heard the Park family signed. That's not a secret. The terms. Also not a secret. The terms were communicated to all underbosses within 24 hours. You were briefed. I was briefed. Min looked at the table between them, then at Tae-hyun. The Gyeonggi Western routes, the adjustment of the boundary lines, that cuts into the overlap corridor we've been running through. The overlap corridor that was technically the Park family's territory that we were running through without formal agreement because the boundary dispute kept it gray. It's not gray anymore. The corridor goes back to Park. That corridor runs through 3 of my distribution points. Then you'll redirect the distribution points. That's what the transition timeline is for. 90 days is generous. Min was quiet for a moment. He had a specific kind of quiet, the kind that was doing arithmetic. Tae-hyun let it run. He had nothing to prove by filling silence. The other underbosses, Min said finally, the Eastern men, they weren't consulted on the Park terms either. I don't consult underbosses on treaty terms. That's not how the organization is structured, and it's not how it's ever been structured. Some of them feel the structure has been, Min paused, selecting the word with visible care, less transparent recently. Tae-hyun looked at him steadily. Which ones? That's not... Which ones, Min? The older man's jaw moved slightly. This isn't about names. I'm bringing you information because it's my responsibility to... You're bringing me a message from people who didn't want to deliver it themselves, Tae-hyun said. Which means you either volunteered because you think you can manage this better than they can, or they sent you because they think I'll go easier on a senior underboss than I would on them. Either way, you're here as a proxy, and I don't have conversations with proxies. So you can tell me who specifically is raising concerns about transparency, or this meeting is finished and I'll find out another way, which will be worse for everyone. The room had a specific temperature now. Not raised voices, not visible anger, something more precise. The particular pressure of a situation where the wrong word could break something that couldn't be put back together. Min's hands were flat on the table. He was controlling his breathing with the practiced effort of a man who understood that visible physical tension was a form of information he didn't want to give. Ryo, he said, and Han Seong-woo. Tae-hyun said nothing. Ryo Sung-bai was the Northwestern underboss. Han Seong-woo was the sole central operations manager. Both of them had been with the organization for more than 7 years. Both of them were smart enough to be valuable and ambitious enough to be a problem if the conditions were right. What exactly are they saying? Tae-hyun said. Flat. No inflection. That the Park Treaty closes off options they'd been building toward. Min's voice was more careful now, picking each word up and placing it down like he was crossing ice. The boundary realignment restricts some of the expansion corridors they'd identified in Gyeonggi. They feel they should have been part of the conversation. They feel. They've been with the organization a long time. So had Lee Byung-chul. Tae-hyun said it without particular emphasis, the way you stated a fact. He watched Min's face absorb it. The implication was clean and didn't need elaboration. They both knew exactly what it meant. You could be with the organization for a long time. That did not change what happened when you decided your personal interests outweighed the structure. Min sat very still. Tell Ryo and Han to come see me directly, Tae-hyun said. Not through you, themselves. If they have specific concerns about operational impacts on their territories, I'll hear them. That's the process. If they have concerns about the process itself, he stopped. Let the rest of it sit in the air without being said. Are we clear? Yes, Min said. Then we're done. He stood. Min stood. They did not shake hands. Min walked out with Dong-su and the door closed behind them, and Tae-hyun stood at the window of the consultation room and looked at the gray December sky and did the arithmetic himself. Ryo, Han, Min, who was either their messenger or their advance scout, or something else entirely that he didn't have full visibility on yet. 3 men, at minimum. a collective discomfort with the park treaty that was specific enough to have produced coordinated action, even if that action was only showing up unannounced with a careful message framed as concern. He had seen this pattern before. He knew what it looked like at this stage, and he knew what it looked like 6 months later if it wasn't addressed, and he knew the range of methods available for addressing it. He stood at the window and breathed through the weight of it. The constant, relentless, exhausting weight of a world where you could never let anything sit unattended, where every relationship was a variable that needed monitoring, where the management of human disloyalty was as constant and routine as any other operational function. From 2 wings away, so faint he almost missed it, he heard Zuri's voice. She was singing, something without words, just a melody, invented as it went, wandering and doubled back on itself and wandered again. The small automatic sound of a child at work on something that mattered to her. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he turned and went back to his office and called Dong-Su. "I want full recent contact logs for Ryu and Han," he said when Dong-Su appeared. 2 months. Who they've been talking to, meeting with, where their numbers have moved. Don't approach either of them directly yet. Understood. Dong-Su paused. And Min? Min too. Dong-Su nodded and left. Tae-hyun sat down at his desk. The open door framed a rectangle of corridor, and at its far end, the light from the west sitting room, warm, incidental, ordinary. He stared at the documents in front of him and thought about Ryu and Han and Min and the shape of a thing that was beginning to assemble itself in his peripheral vision, and he did not like the shape of it. Naomi found out about Min Junho's visit the same day, not because anyone told her, but because she understood how to read a house. She had learned this skill early, growing up in Atlanta in a home where the temperature of a room told you everything you needed to know before anyone said a word. And it had become, over the years, a kind of second fluency. Not the words being said, but the quality of the air around the words. The way people position their bodies relative to one another. The route someone took through a space, and what that route told you about what they were thinking about. The estate had a particular atmosphere after Min's visit. Not visibly different, but different in the way she could feel. A tightening, like weather pressure dropping before a storm. The guard's rotation changed slightly in the afternoon. Dong-Su moved through the house faster than his usual controlled pace, which for Dong-Su was significant. 2 men she'd never seen before arrived at the north entrance and were there for an hour and then gone. And Tae-hyun's office door, which had been open every morning for the past week and a half, was closed. She noticed this in the way that she'd noticed everything about this house, carefully, without showing that she was noticing, filing it in the category of information that was hers to hold and not to act on. She cleaned the east corridor. She managed the afternoon supply inventory. She kept Zuri settled in the west sitting room, where the little girl was currently engaged in what appeared to be a major artistic project involving every color she owned and an ambitious landscape of a forest full of animals, each animal painted with a slightly different expression. At 3 in the afternoon, Zuri held up a section of the painting and said, "Does this elephant look sad or thinking?" Naomi looked. The elephant, green because Zuri had run out of gray, had large round eyes and a slightly downturned mouth. "Thinking," Naomi said. "I think sad," Zuri said. "I'm going to give it a friend." She turned back to the paper and began adding, beside the green elephant, a smaller figure that appeared to be either a very large bird or a very small horse, rendered in purple. Naomi sat back in her chair and watched her daughter paint and tried to quiet the part of her mind that was doing its own version of the same arithmetic she had no business doing. She was a housekeeper. That was the clear fact. Whatever the strange texture of this arrangement, whatever the way that the last 2 weeks had shifted the ordinary coordinates of what she'd expected this job to be, she was a housekeeper in the household of a man who ran a criminal organization in a country that was not her country, and the boundaries of that situation were not vague. She knew what she'd gotten herself into. She'd known from week 1, not from anything specific that had been said or shown, but from the general architecture of things, the security, the controlled information, the locked doors, the late-night arrivals of men who arrived without names and left without being seen. She wasn't naive. She'd grown up around enough men who ran things sideways to recognize the particular atmosphere of a life that operated in the space between legal and illegal. And this was that atmosphere turned up considerably. She had needed the job. She still needed the job. And the job, for all its complications, had been, unexpectedly, confusingly, something other than purely transactional. She was not supposed to think about the apple juice. She thought about the apple juice. The way it had simply appeared beside Zuri's painting materials one afternoon, without comment, without announcement, without any performance of generosity. Just there, placed precisely, and gone from the room before Zuri had looked up from her work. She had thought about it more than she should have. She had thought about what it meant that a man who ran his household, his business, and apparently a significant portion of South Korea's underworld with the controlled precision of someone who never did anything without calculation, had placed a small bottle of apple juice next to a 3-year-old's crayons and walked away before anyone could respond to it. It meant something. She didn't know exactly what. She knew that letting herself think about what it meant was dangerous in a very particular way, and she was good at recognizing danger. She was not always good at stepping back from it. At 4:15, Dong-soo appeared in the doorway of the west sitting room. He did this sometimes. Checked the room in passing, not with any apparent agenda, just confirmed that everything was as it should be and moved on. She had calibrated him early. Dong-soo was not an obstacle and not a threat, as long as she stayed inside the lines, and he communicated the lines through his own behavior rather than through explicit instruction, which she'd found was actually a more efficient system. "Ms. Brooks," he said. "Mr. Park." He looked at the room, at Zuri, who had not looked up from the forest painting, at the organized setup of painting materials, the neat stack of completed pages, the backpack stowed out of the way of traffic. "Mr. Kang will be working late tonight," Dong-soo said. "The household dinner schedule will adjust. Kitchen will run later." "I'll adjust accordingly," Dong-soo nodded. He was about to turn when Zuri said, without looking up, "Is the sad man okay?" Dong-soo's forward motion stopped. Naomi's stomach dropped approximately 2 floors. Zuri looked up at Dong-soo with the direct, unedited attention she gave everything. "He closed his door today," she said. "He usually leaves it open now. When people close their doors, it's because they're sad or they need to think." Dong-soo stood in the doorway looking at the 3-year-old. The 3-year-old looked back at him with complete equanimity. "He's okay," Dong-soo said, after a pause that was barely perceptible but that Naomi caught. "He has work to do." "Oh," Zuri said. She considered this. "Okay." She looked back at her painting. "I'm going to give the elephant a butterfly. Butterflies make people feel better." She said it as a simple statement of observed fact. Dong-soo looked at Naomi. Just briefly. Something moved in his face. Not humor exactly, but the distant relation of humor that lived in a man who kept everything behind glass. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Naomi let out the breath she'd been holding. "Zuri," she said quietly. Let's maybe not." "He looked sad yesterday too," Zuri said, "when he walked by. His shoulders do a thing." She demonstrated, pulling her own small shoulders inward slightly. "Like this. That means sad." Naomi stared at her daughter. "Let's not talk about Mr. Kang's shoulders," she said carefully. "Why?" "Because it's not—" She stopped. "It's not our business." Zuri thought about this with visible seriousness, the way she thought about everything. But if someone's sad, isn't it everybody's business? Naomi had no good answer to that. She looked at her daughter for a long moment and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Something that sat between pride and unease, between wanting to wrap the child in everything protective and knowing that the impulse itself was a form of fear. "Paint your elephant," she said. Zuri painted her elephant. "What?" The contact logs came back to Dong-soo by 7 that evening, and he brought them to Taehyun at the desk where Taehyun had been sitting for 4 hours, working through the operational restructuring that the Park Treaty had made necessary. The logs were thorough. Dong-soo was always thorough. Taehyun read them once, quickly, getting the shape of it. Then he read them again, slower, building the detail. Ryo and Han had been in contact with each other 17 times in the past 6 weeks. That alone wasn't conclusive. They ran adjacent territories. There was legitimate operational reason for regular communication, but the frequency had increased sharply in the last 10 days, which put the uptick right against the announcement of the Park Treaty. More significant, 4 of those contacts had been routed through third-party numbers, burner phones registered to addresses in Busan and Jeju that had no connection to the organization. You used clean phones when you were saying things you didn't want traced. That was not ambiguous. Min had been in contact with both of them 6 times. He had also been in contact twice in the last 4 days with a man named Song Do-hyun, which was the detail that made Tae-hyun's jaw tighten in a way he could feel at the back of his skull. Song Do-hyun was nominally independent, operating in the margins between 3 major syndicates, doing the kind of facilitation work that required someone comfortable in gray spaces and unattached to any single organization. He was the person you called when you needed something done that you didn't want coming back to you. He was also, and had been for 6 years, a known intermediary for the Daegu cartel, which was the single organization in South Korea that had the resources and the motive to want the Jongil syndicate destabilized. Tae-hyun sat back in his chair. Min hadn't come to warn him. Min hadn't come with a message from disgruntled underbosses who wanted structural reform. Min had come to read the room, to assess Tae-hyun's response to the word transparency, to see if the concern delivery would land as genuine, to find out how much Tae-hyun already knew. What was building wasn't a complaints process. It was a buyout. Someone had gone to the Daegu cartel and sold them the parameters of a possible internal fracture in the Jongil syndicate, and the Daegu people had paid for it because they were patient and strategic and had been waiting for exactly this kind of leverage for the better part of a decade. And now the mechanism was in motion, and Min was both a participant and an insurance policy and possibly a triple play whose actual allegiance was still unclear. Tae-hyun looked at the logs for another moment. Then he said to Dong-soo, "How many people know these logs were pulled?" 2. Myself and the analyst. Keep it there. Don't move on Rio or Han yet. Don't let Min know he's being watched. He paused. Song Do-hyun. I want a location. Current. Dong-soo nodded. He didn't ask why. He had been doing this long enough to fill in that blank himself. Tonight, Tae-hyun said. Yes, sir. Dong-soo left. Tae-hyun stood up from the desk and walked to the window and stood there in the dark, looking at the mountain ridge where the clouds had come in thick and low, eliminating the distance. He had built this organization on the principle that loyalty was a transaction, not a virtue. He had tested every person inside these walls precisely because he knew the value of loyalty was 0 without the architecture to enforce it. He had been right. He was always right about this. He was exhausted from being right about this. He stood at the window and felt the familiar machinery of response engage, the cold analytical inventory of threat, response option, cost, collateral, and it ran through him the way it always ran, automatic and comprehensive, the most reliable thing about him. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He was already alone. Through the closed door of his office, through the corridor and the turn and the length of the West Wing, there was light still on. Naomi keeping Zuri settled late because the dinner schedule had shifted, both of them in the sitting room, the small, ordinary sounds of a child getting ready to stop for the day. He didn't go to the West Wing. He stood at the window and worked through the shape of what was coming. It was Naomi who saw Min Jun-ho leave that night. She hadn't planned to be in the East Corridor at 9:40 p.m., but Zuri had woken from a light sleep asking for water, and Naomi had gone to the kitchen and come back through the East Passage because it was direct. And she had come around the corner at the exact moment that Min was being walked out by 2 of Tae-hyun's security men. She pressed herself back into the alcove before she thought about it. Pure instinct, the reflexive self-erasure of someone who'd learned that being seen at the wrong moment in the wrong place cost you things you couldn't always get back. Min passed 3 feet from her. He didn't look her way. He was looking straight ahead, and his face was the face of a man managing a serious internal calculation, and his hands, she could see his hands from where she stood, were slightly stiff at his sides, the fingers not quite curled. The security men took him to the north exit. The door closed. Naomi stood in the alcove for a moment and let the adrenaline run through and out, and then she walked back to the sitting room where Zuri was already half asleep again, the stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm, and the elephant, Gerald, under the other. She sat in the chair beside her daughter and listened to the house breathe around her and thought about the look on Min's face and the stiffness in his hands and the way the security men had been positioned. Not quite escort, not quite guard, somewhere in the geometry between those 2 things, that told you the situation had moved past conversation. She thought about what she was sitting in the middle of. She thought about Zuri's voice saying he looked lonely while you were sleeping, and the sound of Tae-hyun's laugh breaking through the sitting room like something that had been held underwater for a long time finally coming up for air. She thought about the apple juice. She looked at her daughter's sleeping face and felt the weight of everything that was wrong with the situation. The danger of it, the precariousness, the specific kind of foolishness involved in having feelings about a man who operated in a world where people who got in the way of what he needed to protect had a finite life expectancy. She needed to be clear about this. She needed to draw a harder line. She was deciding to draw that line when the door opened. Not Dong-soo, not a guard, Tae-hyun. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at Zuri, at the sleeping child and the giraffe and the elephant, at the paintings laid out across the low table to dry. And then he looked at Naomi, who was still sitting in the chair and had not moved because there was no useful move to make. She looked back at him. He was tired. Not the ordinary end-of-day tired, but the deep kind. The kind she'd seen on her father's face when she was a child. The kind that came from carrying something you couldn't put down. He was in the same clothes he'd had on all day, and he'd loosened his tie at some point, the knot pulled down, the collar open, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like the armor had come off, or at least like the weight of wearing it was fully visible. He didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't either. Then he said, "Is she all right?" "She's fine," Naomi said. She fell asleep again. He looked at Zuri. "She asked about you," Naomi said, and then wished she hadn't, because that wasn't the line she'd just been deciding to draw. He looked at her. "What did she ask?" "She noticed you closed your door today." She paused. "She said your shoulders do a thing when you're sad." Something moved in his face, crossed it fast and went under. "She's 3 years old," he said. "She pays attention." He looked at Zuri again. He stood in the doorway with the hallway dark behind him, and Naomi watched him from the chair and felt the conversation sitting at the edge of something, balanced there, not yet fallen. "There's going to be a difficult few weeks," he said. Not to her exactly, to the room. "I may need the household schedule to be more flexible. I can make that work. It might mean irregular hours. I can increase the compensation. You don't need to increase anything," she said. "I'll make it work." He looked at her directly then, and she looked back at him, and for a moment the distance between what this was supposed to be and what it was actually becoming was visible to both of them, clear and exact. Neither of them named it. "I know what loneliness feels like," she said. She didn't plan to say it. It came out without the usual architecture of self-protection, without the layer between the feeling and the words. He went very still. She felt the air in the room change in the specific way that air changed when something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and she felt simultaneously that she had made a serious mistake, and that the mistake had been the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in the 14 months since she'd arrived in this country and begun the careful process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of the last one. He didn't respond. He looked at her for 3 seconds and then looked at the floor, and then he said very quietly, "Get some rest." He turned and walked down the corridor. She sat in the chair and listened to his footsteps recede, and then she sat in the silence that came after. And in the silence, somewhere in the north wing, she heard a door close. And then, muffled by walls and distance but unmistakable, she heard his voice. On the phone, low, controlled, and in it something she had not heard before. Something that did not fit with everything else she thought she understood about the man who lived in this house. Urgency. Not the managed urgency of someone running a strategic operation. The raw kind. The kind that meant something had just changed or was about to change, and the change was the kind. The phone call lasted 11 minutes. Tae-hyun stood at the window of his office with his back to the room and his phone pressed hard against his ear and listened to what Dong-soo had found. And while he listened, he watched the clouds move across the mountain ridge, and he kept his breathing steady with the particular controlled discipline of a man who understood that whatever he was feeling right now was information he could not afford to show. Songdo-hyun was in Seoul, not Busan, where the clean phone registrations had pointed, not Jeju, where 2 of the burner numbers traced back to addresses that turned out to be vacant storefronts. Song was in Seoul, in a serviced apartment in Mapogu that had been rented 3 weeks ago under a corporate name that traced, through 2 holding companies, to a Daegu cartel's subsidiary. 3 weeks. The apartment had been secured 3 weeks ago, which was 1 week before the Park Treaty was signed, which meant someone had given the Daegu people advance information on the treaty timeline before it was public, before it was even finalized. There were exactly 4 people who had known the treaty was close to resolution 3 weeks ago. Tae-hyun, himself, Dong-soo, and 2 members of the legal team who had been drafting the terms. And someone else, someone who had been inside the negotiation architecture without being officially part of it. Someone with access to the East Wing consultation room, to the timing of arrivals and departures, to the pattern of movement through the house that told you when something significant was happening even if you didn't know the specific content. Tae-hyun's hand tightened on the phone until he felt the pressure in his knuckles. "The apartment," he said quietly. "Who else has access?" "To 2 names on the rental," Dong-soo said. "Song and a woman. The name is probably clean. We're running it now. But the access logs show 3 entry cards issued. 3rd card. Not registered to a name. Issued as a guest card through the building management. Cash transaction. No identity verification required. Cameras. We're pulling them. Fast," Tae-hyun said. "Tonight." He ended the call. He stood at the window for 60 seconds exactly. He counted, because counting was a mechanism, and mechanisms kept him functional when the alternative was something he could not afford. And then he turned and walked back to his desk and sat down and looked at the wall. 3 weeks ago. Someone had been inside the preliminary treaty discussions and had taken that information directly to the Daegu cartel. That was not the same category of problem as Ryo and Han nursing territorial grievances, or Min playing proxy politics. That was infiltration. That was a breach at a level of proximity to him that he had believed, with the confidence of 12 years of careful operational security, was not possible. He had been wrong. He could count on one hand the number of times in his adult life he had been wrong about something this fundamental, and 2 of those times had cost him people he couldn't get back. He sat at his desk and breathed and did not allow himself to spiral into the full implications of it, because spiraling was what you did when you had the luxury of time, and he did not have that luxury. He had a cell in Mapogu, a 3rd keycard, a man named Song Do-hyun, who was either brokering or facilitating or both, and somewhere in the near architecture of his own organization, a source. He began making a list. That. By midnight, he had the camera footage. Dong-soo brought it on a laptop and set it on the desk and stood back and let Tae-hyun watch it without comment, which was the correct thing to do because Tae-hyun needed to see it clean, without interpretation layered over it, just the raw image and his own eyes. The footage was from the building's lobby camera. Angle from above and slightly to the left, the way lobby cameras always were. Good for identifying motion and general appearance, less useful for faces unless someone looked up. The timestamp was from 8 days ago, 11:20 p.m. Traffic in the lobby was light. A figure came through the glass doors, medium height, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who knew where they were going and had been there before. Dark coat. The angle showed the back and the profile as the figure turned to press the elevator button. Tae-hyun watched the figure turn. He recognized the coat first. A dark wool coat with a specific cut, double-breasted, the kind of coat that was expensive in a restrained way that didn't advertise itself. He had seen that coat in his own house. He had seen it draped over the chair in the east corridor when the wearer had come inside out of the rain and had not yet reached the closet. He watched the figure press the elevator button and turn slightly further and give the camera, for approximately 1.5 seconds, a partial view of the face. He had hired her 6 weeks ago through a placement agency. She had 3 references, a clean background screen, and a professional history that bore out on verification. She had learned his household with impressive speed. She had never asked questions about the locked rooms or the late-night visitors. She had restructured the supply inventory and reduced quarterly waste by 12%. She had a daughter named Zuri who painted butterflies and left apple juice bottles empty and called him the sad man with tired eyes. Her name was Naomi Brooks, and she was walking into the Daegu cartel's operational apartment in Mapogu at 11:20 on a Tuesday night while her daughter slept in the guest room at the east end of his estate. Tae-hyun sat very still. He was aware of his own heartbeat, the particular cadence of it, not accelerated, Not the rush of adrenaline that a threat usually produced, but something stranger and slower and worse. A heaviness, like a door closing in a room you'd just begun to believe had been open for a reason. He watched the footage for another 10 seconds, even though he'd already seen everything it had to show him. Then he closed the laptop. Dong-soo said nothing. "How long have you had this?" Taehyun said. His voice came out level. He was mildly surprised by that. 20 minutes. I came as soon as I'd confirmed the coat. Before you came to me, did you confirm it any other way? I pulled her cell records going back to her start date. Dong-soo set a printed sheet on the desk. 11 contacts with numbers that traced to Daegu-connected lines. First contact was 2 days before she arrived here. 2 days before she arrived. She had not been placed by the agency. She had been placed through the agency. The distinction was precise and critical, and it meant the vetting process he had trusted had been circumvented at the source, which meant someone had gotten to the agency before she was ever in his house, which meant this had been planned with a lead time and a specificity that was not improvisation. This was architecture. Someone had built this carefully and then walked it in through his front door wearing a gray coat and sensible shoes, moving with the squared back posture of a woman who had decided to look like she belonged everywhere she was. And it had worked. It had worked because he had let it work, because he had opened his office door and left apple juice on a table and felt something in his chest. Do a thing it hadn't done in years, and he had not shut it down with the efficiency that he shut everything else down, and that failure of efficiency had a shape. Now, and the shape was this: a partial face on a lobby camera, a printed sheet of 11 phone contacts, and the specific, sickening weight of having been made a fool of by his own carefully managed loneliness. He stood up. "Where is she now?" he said. "East guest room. The child is with her." "And the child?" He stopped, forced himself through the question because it needed to be asked, even though everything in him resisted the specific shape of it. "The child is part of this." Dong-soo's jaw was tight. Unknown. Unknown was not no. Taehyun walked to the window. The mountain was gone in the dark, and the cloud, invisible, replaced by his own reflection in the glass. Face hard, tie still loosened, a man standing in his own house surrounded by the evidence of how completely he had underestimated the risk of feeling something. "Don't move on her tonight," he said. "Sir, the child is 3 years old." His voice stayed flat. "We are not moving on a woman with a 3-year-old child in the middle of the night based on a lobby camera and a phone record. Tomorrow, after the child is out of the house." Dong-soo was quiet for a moment. Taehyun could feel him calculating whether to push back and deciding against it. "Tomorrow," Dong-soo said. "I want Song Do-hyun's location confirmed by 6 a.m. I want to know who issued the third keycard, and I want to know—" He stopped, pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, and breathed. "I want to know who at the agency was accessed, who placed her file, how deep this goes before it gets to Daegu." "Yes, sir." "That's all." Dong-soo left. Taehyun stood at the window for a long time. He thought about the morning with the paint on his face, the involuntary laugh breaking out of him after years of managed quiet, the open door, the apple juice, the afternoon last week when he'd slowed his walk past the sitting room, not for any operational reason, but because he'd wanted to see what color butterfly she was painting that day. He thought about Naomi in the corridor with the sleeping child in her lap, and the measured steadiness of her voice when she'd accepted his offer of the guest room, the way she'd looked at him and evaluated the offer and found it genuine, or performed finding it genuine, and said, "Okay. I know what loneliness feels like." He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. He thought about all the ways loneliness made you stupid, all the ways it created apertures in systems that had been built specifically to have no apertures. He had been operating without an emotional blind spot for 12 years, and it had taken 6 weeks and a woman with a squared back posture and a 3-year-old with a paintbrush to locate the exact coordinates of the one he hadn't known he had. He stayed at the window until 2 in the morning. He did not sleep. At 7 a.m. Naomi brought Zuri into the kitchen for breakfast, which was her routine, and Taehyun was already there. This was not her routine. He ate in his office or the East Wing, not the kitchen, not with household staff. She registered his presence in the doorway and absorbed it without changing her expression, and Tae-hyun watched her absorb it and felt, against every reasonable response, a specific kind of pain that he catalogued and set aside and would not look at again. She was good. That was the fact of it. Whatever she was exceptionally good at this. Zuri ran to the kitchen table with the confident ownership of a child who had decided a space was hers, and climbed into a chair and began the business of breakfast with great seriousness. Naomi stood at the counter with her back half turned and started coffee, and her hands were steady and her shoulders were squared, and there was nothing in her body language that looked like a woman who had been 11 floors above ground in a Daegu-connected apartment 8 nights ago. "Good morning," she said to the counter, to the coffee, to the general air of the kitchen. "Sit down," Tae-hyun said. She turned. He watched her read of the room. He watched it happen. The rapid practice scan that she did without moving her eyes, obviously, cataloging the variables, assessing the temperature of the moment. She was doing it right now, and she was doing it well, and he saw her do it and saw the precise moment she decided on a response. "I need to start the East Corridor," she said. "If you need to speak with me, I can—" "Sit down, Naomi." The name. He had never used it directly. He'd always used Ms. Brooks or nothing at all. The name landed in the kitchen, and she felt it land. He could see that too, the very slight change in the way she was holding herself, the recalibration. She sat down. Zuri was eating, unconcerned, working through a bowl of fruit with her characteristic focused seriousness. Tae-hyun sat across from Naomi. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and they were both doing the same thing, reading, assessing, deciding. And the difference was that he already had his answer, and she didn't yet know that he did. "Tell me about Atlanta," he said. She blinked. "I've told you the real part." His voice was quiet, completely controlled. "The part that brought you here. The specific thing that happened. Not the version that was in your file." She was still for a moment, then, "I don't know what you mean." "You relocated 14 months ago following significant personal and financial disruption. Those are the agency's words. I want yours." She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was warm from the morning, and outside the windows the mountains were pale gray under a low sky, and Zuri was eating her fruit and making small sounds of culinary satisfaction, and none of that changed the specific temperature of the table between the two adults sitting at it. "I had a bad year," Naomi said carefully. "I needed to start over somewhere new." "What made it bad?" "Does this affect my employment?" "Answer the question." Her jaw tightened. "My daughter's father had a significant amount of debt. When things fell apart, it didn't just fall on him. There were people involved, people I didn't know about, things I wasn't aware of that became my problem when they became his problem." She stopped. "I needed to be somewhere they couldn't follow easily." Tae-hyun held her eyes. "What kind of people?" The silence lasted 3 seconds. "The kind that don't use banks," she said. He nodded slowly. She was looking at him with a different quality now. He could see the edges of something. Not fear exactly, but the precursor to fear, the heightened attentiveness of someone who understood that the conversation had a shape they hadn't been told about, and they were trying to determine that shape in real time. "How did you find this position?" he said. "The agency?" "Before the agency. Who told you the agency?" Her breath moved. Barely. She caught it. "A contact," she said. "Someone I met at a placement event. They mentioned the agency placed household staff in private residences. High-end, good pay." "Name of the contact?" "I don't—" "Naomi." She stopped. Zuri looked up from her bowl. Children had a finely tuned instrument for room temperature, and the instrument had just registered something. She looked at her mother, and then at Tae-hyun, and then back at her mother. "Mommy," she said. "Keep eating, baby," Naomi said. Her voice came out steady. She was breathing carefully. Tae-hyun could see that. The controlled intake, the managed exhale. And something in his chest was doing the thing he'd told himself it couldn't do anymore, and he was overriding it with both hands. "I need you to tell me the contact's name," he said. "I need to know what this is about first." "No," he said. "You don't." The word landed hard. She looked at him, and in her eyes, past the control, past the composure, past the squared back posture and the managed breathing, he saw something that he had not expected to see, and that complicated everything further, which was that she was scared. And the scared was not the kind that came from being caught. It was the kind that came from not knowing what was about to happen, which was a different shape entirely. He had been watching people lie to him for 12 years. He knew the smell of it, the texture, the specific geometry of a face constructing a performance. He had watched the footage from the lobby camera for 4 minutes last night, and he had looked at the phone records and the math had been clear. He looked at Naomi Brooks now and felt the arithmetic start to wobble. "A woman named Park Ji-eun," Naomi said. She said she worked in HR placements. She was Korean, mid-40s, she spoke good English. She was at a job fair at the Cultural Center in Sinchon. I met her in line for coffee. Park Ji-eun was not a name in his files. He kept his face still. "She gave you the agency's name specifically." "She gave me a card. She said they placed domestic staff in high-income households, that the pay was better than most of what I'd find through the English-speaker networks." She paused. I needed something good. I took the card." "Did she tell you anything about the households? Specific names?" "She said there were strict confidentiality requirements, that the placements were with private families, high-security environments. I wouldn't be able to discuss the work outside of it." She looked at him directly. "Which I haven't. I haven't talked to anyone about this house or about you." "Your phone contacts," he said. 11 contacts in the last 6 weeks with numbers I can trace." She went still. "I can see the exact moment you understand what I'm saying," he said quietly. Her hands, flat on the table, were not moving, but they were not relaxed either. He could see the knuckles. "I haven't contacted anyone connected to anything you're involved in," she said. The words came out with a force behind them that was not performance. "Those contacts, you need to tell me who they trace to, because I have no idea. I've been careful. I've been so careful about. They trace to Daegu." She stared at him. He watched her face. "And 8 nights ago," he said, "someone in a coat I've seen in my east corridor walked into a building in Mapogu that is rented by a Daegu-connected holding company. The camera gives me a partial face. The coat is yours." The kitchen was completely silent except for Zuri, who had stopped eating and was sitting very still in her chair with her eyes moving between the two adults with the acute, unhappy attention of a child who understood that something was wrong even without understanding what. "That's not possible," Naomi said. "I have the footage." "That is not possible," she said again, and the repetition had something in it that was not the scripted deflection of someone buying time. It had the particular quality of someone encountering a fact that doesn't fit with what they know to be true and trying to locate the error. "I haven't been to Mapogu in 3 weeks. I've been here, or I've been at our apartment, or I've been at the market on Yongsin Row. 8 nights ago I was here. You were here. I was in the east guest room because Zuri fell asleep in the corridor and you told us to use the room. I was here all night." "Bitol osans." He looked at her. She was not blinking with the excess frequency of someone under stress deploying a lie. Her pupils were not doing what pupils did when the body was running a sustained deception. The shake in her voice was not the shake of someone caught. It was the shake of someone afraid of something that was outside their control. He thought about the coat, the specific coat, where it lived in his house, the east corridor, the chair by the entrance, where any person with access to the ground floor, which was, in the normal course of a business day, multiple people, could have access to it. He thought about the third key card, cash transaction, no identity verification, a card issued to no registered name. He looked at Naomi Brooks across the kitchen table and felt the arithmetic reorient itself around a new variable. And the new variable was this. Someone had used her presence in this house, her coat, her access, possibly her identity, as cover for an operation she had never been told about. The woman at the job fair who spoke good English and gave her a card. The clean background file that bore out on verification because someone had built it to bear out. The phone contacts that traced to Daegu line she had called without knowing what they were. Numbers given to her by a handler she believed was something else. Not an infiltrator. A vehicle. And somewhere in the house right now, or at large in the city with a key card, and full access to the knowledge that the Daegu cartel had positioned a woman and her child inside the Jong-il Syndicate's primary residence, There was someone who knew exactly how this was about to. He didn't finish the sentence. His phone moved on the table between them. A single vibration, then another, then a third in rapid succession that meant Dong-su was not calling but signaling, the specific pattern they used when something required immediate response and could not wait for a return call. Tae-hyun picked up the phone. The message was 4 words. Song is not alone. He was on his feet before he finished reading it. Stay in this room, he said to Naomi. The words came out flat and absolute, with no room in them for negotiation. Do not go into the corridor. Do not open any door that isn't this one. Do you understand me? She was already pulling Zuri from the chair, the small girl tucked against her side, both of Naomi's arms wrapped around her. What's happening? Do you understand me? Yes, she said. He moved. The north wing was where it started. Dong-su met him in the corridor outside the consultation room, and the look on Dong-su's face, not the controlled neutral of 12 years of service, but something tighter, something with edges, told Tae-hyun the shape of the next few minutes before a word was said. Song Do-hyun is in the building, Dong-su said, very low. Tae-hyun's entire body went cold. How? Service entrance, east side. The third card, the guest card. It was registered for service access, not residential. We were looking at the wrong entry point. Dong-su's jaw was rigid. He came in 40 minutes ago. We caught the camera in the utility corridor 2 minutes ago when I ran the extended sweep. How many with him? 2 confirmed, possibly 3. Armed. Yes. Tae-hyun processed this in the time it took to take one breath. Song Do-hyun in his house. Not at the Mapogu apartment waiting to broker. Here, inside the walls, which meant this had moved from intelligence operation to direct action, which meant the Daegu cartel had decided that the time for information gathering was finished and the time for something else had begun. My men, he said, 6 on ground floor, 2 upstairs. I've pulled the upstairs pair down. I didn't want movement above until we knew the positions. Ryo, Han. Neither of them are responding to contact, which meant they were either part of this or they'd been warned to be unavailable, and the distinction didn't matter right now. Min. Also dark. 3 underbosses simultaneously unreachable at 7 in the morning was not coincidence. That was coordination. That was the thing he'd seen the outline of in the phone records and the contact logs now arriving in full, and it was uglier than he'd estimated, and he had estimated ugly. Lock the kitchen wing, he said. Nobody goes in or out. There is a woman and a child in there. Already posted a man on the door. 1 isn't enough. 2 then. 2, Tae-hyun said. And he was already moving down the corridor toward the north wing because Song Do-hyun was in his house, and whatever Song had come here to do, he was going to do it on Tae-hyun's terms, or not at all. They found Song in the East Library. It was not accidental. The library connected to the consultation room through a narrow secondary passage that most people who hadn't memorized the floor plan didn't know about, and Song Do-hyun, knowing it meant someone had given him detailed architectural information, which was another layer of breach that Tae-hyun filed and would deal with when there was time to deal with it. Song was 50 years old, lean, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of existing in spaces where the wrong expression could get you killed. He was standing at the east wall of the library when Tae-hyun's men came through the door, and he had his hands visible, both of them, open, held slightly out from his sides in the specific posture of a man who was communicating that this was a conversation, not a confrontation. Not yet. His 2 men were positioned at the room's other entries. Tae-hyun's 6 were already around the room's perimeter. The arithmetic of force was clear to everyone present. Tae-hyun walked in and looked at Song Do-hyun across the library and felt the specific quality of the air in the room, pressurized, the way air got when too many armed people occupied too small a space with too much at stake, and he kept his face exactly where he'd kept it for the last 12 years. Still, cold, completely in control of the version of himself that the room was going to see. You broke my service entrance, Tae-hyun said. That's going to cost you before we're finished. Song's mouth moved, not quite a smile. No breach. The card was legitimate. The card was fraudulent. That's a different thing than illegitimate, and you know the difference. I know a lot of differences. Song's hand stayed open. His voice was the voice of a man who moved between organizations for a living and had therefore developed a tone that was fluent in whoever's register he needed. Right now it was calibrated for Tae-hyun's frequency, controlled and direct. No performance. I came here to talk. That's all. You came here with 2 armed men at 7 in the morning. You keep armed men in your own house. I don't think you want to have the conversation about what armed men mean. Tae-hyun looked at him for 3 seconds. Talk, he said. Song moved his eyes around the room, at the guards, back to Tae-hyun. Private, Song said. No. A beat. Song accepted this with a slight movement of his head. He'd expected it, or he'd prepared for it. The Daegu family has a proposal. The Daegu family sent an intermediary through my service entrance with armed escorts to deliver a proposal at 7 in the morning. That's not how proposals work. The timeline is compressed. Whose timeline? Everyone's. Song's voice stayed level, but something in it tightened fractionally. There are events in motion, things that were set up before I was involved. I want you to understand that I came here because I thought a conversation was better than the alternative. What alternative? Song looked at him. Tae-hyun felt the back of his neck go cold. Say it, Tae-hyun said. Ryo and Han have moved, Song said, as of an hour ago. Their people are at the Incheon Distribution Center and both Busan port offices. They're not there to review inventory. The Incheon Distribution Center was the operational spine of the Eastern Network. The Busan offices managed 40% of the organization's legitimate revenue flow. Simultaneous seizure of both meant the fracture wasn't coming. It had arrived. Min, Tae-hyun said. Min is with them. 3 underbosses. A third of his senior operational structure, coordinated and in position as of 1 hour ago. The Daegu family and his library with a proposal. Song Do-hyun standing between them as the clean hands option, the version of this that didn't require anyone to pull a trigger if Tae-hyun was willing to sit down and listen. He understood the architecture now in full. This was not a coup attempt. It was a forced negotiation, Ryo and Han holding the Eastern operations as collateral, while Daegu presented terms. The violence was the backdrop, not the plan. The plan was to bring him to the table with no leverage and see what he'd give up to get his organization back intact. 12 years. He had spent 12 years building something that could not be taken, and it was being taken right now while he stood in his own library at 7 in the morning in the same clothes he'd worn all night. He breathed. What does Daegu want? He said. A seat, Song said. At the table. Formalized revenue share across the Western distribution network, 40%, in exchange for returning control of Incheon and Busan and standing down Ryo and Han. Ryo and Han are already dead to me. That may be. But their people are at your facilities right now, and the men at those facilities don't know that yet. And by the time they figure it out, if there's no agreement, the damage to those operations is going to be, I understand the damage, Tae-hyun said. I don't need you to explain the damage to me. Song stopped. Tae-hyun looked at the wall. Not at Song. At the wall. At the shelves of books he had never read because he had not had a life that included reading, and at the grain of the wood behind the shelves, and at his own reflection in the dark glass of the cabinet door at the room's far end. A man in yesterday's clothes who had not slept and who had spent the last 12 hours discovering the specific dimensions of his own blind spot. Tell them I need 2 hours, he said. Song blinked. 2 hours? To review the terms. To make decisions that can't be unmade. He looked back at Song. That's a reasonable request, and they know it's reasonable, and if they say no, then tell them the conversation is finished and we find out which version of the next 12 hours everyone survives. Song looked at him for a moment. Then he said, I'll relay it. Do that. And Song... Tae-hyun let his eyes move to Song's 2 men, then back. Your people wait in the East Corridor, not armed, or they wait outside the gate. That's not negotiable. Song held his gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded once. Tae-hyun turned and walked out of the library. In the corridor, he stopped walking and put his hand against the wall and breathed. Not for long. 15 seconds. The amount of time he needed to let the full weight of the situation settle through him without breaking anything it landed on, and then he straightened and he put the weight somewhere he could carry it, and he started moving again. Dong-soo fell into step beside him. He had been in the library. He had heard everything. "Talk to me," Tae-hyun said. "Incheon has 11 of our men on site. Busan has 8 and 4. Rio and Han's people outnumber them in each location. We think by roughly 2 to 1. Dong-soo's voice was low and very precise. "No shots fired yet. Ryu and Han are holding position, not escalating, consistent with them wanting a resolution at the table rather than a firefight. They're still useful to Daegu alive and with clean hands. A firefight makes them liabilities." Tae-hyun turned the corner toward his office. "Who do we have outside Ryo and Han's reach right now? Loyal, certain, senior." "Choi Jae-min, he's Seoul-based, outside the Eastern Corridor entirely. Park Hyun-woo in Suwon. 2 others I'd stake my judgment on. Get them moving, not to Incheon or Busan. Well, I don't want direct confrontation yet. Get them to the relay points and hold." "And the 2 hours?" "I need one of them." Tae-hyun pushed open the door of his office. "The other hour is a number I gave Song to make him comfortable." He sat down at his desk. The documents from last night were still there. The contact logs, the printed sheets, the closed laptop with the lobby footage. He stacked them to one side without looking at them. He needed to think. He had 40% of his senior operational structure in open mutiny, Daegu using them as a lever, a service entrance breach, an intelligence leak that had run for at least 3 weeks, and no direct path to the 3 men who had betrayed him without burning the Eastern operations in the process. He also had a woman and a child in his kitchen who were either the cleanest incidental casualty in the history of this organization or something more complicated than that. And he did not have time to sit with that question, but the question was sitting with him regardless. He pulled a piece of paper toward him and began writing names. He went to the kitchen at 7:40. Naomi was standing at the counter when he came in. Zuri was at the table with her backpack open, the giraffe and Gerald already deployed, a sheet of paper in front of her, and a crayon in her hand. The normalcy of it, the absolute intact normalcy of a 3-year-old conducting her morning with complete commitment to her own purposes, regardless of what was happening in the walls around her, hit him somewhere in the chest that he had designated a no-access zone approximately 20 minutes ago. He looked at Naomi. "Sit," he said. She sat. She had the specific composure of someone who had been holding themselves together for the last 40 minutes and was going to keep holding even if it cost her every last resource she had. "The woman at the job fair," he said. "Park Ji-yeon. Describe her." Naomi described her. Height, build, hair, the way she moved, a small scar at the corner of her left eye, the specific type of card she'd given. Plain, professional, nothing on it but the agency's name and a phone number. Tae-hyun listened and built the picture and cross-referenced it against what he knew, and what he found was this. The description matched no one in his current intelligence on Daegu-connected operatives, which meant Park Ji-yeon, real name unknown, was a deep-cover asset, someone Daegu had placed at the periphery specifically for approaches like this one. Someone clean enough to hand a card to a woman in a coffee line and never appear in any record he had access to. "The phone numbers," he said, "the ones that trace to Daegu. Do you know what those numbers are?" "One of them is the agency," she said. "The number on the card. I called it to schedule the placement interview. The others, I'd have to see the list. I don't know." He slid the printed sheet across the table. She looked at it. Her finger moved down the column of numbers, and he watched her face while she did it, watching for the micro-expressions that told him what he needed to know, the ones that bypassed conscious control because they happened too fast. She stopped on the 3rd number. Her face did something. "That one," she said. "That's the number I was given for the on-call agency coordinator. If I had a scheduling issue, a sick day, any change to the arrangement, I was supposed to call that number." He had already known that. He had needed to watch her figure it out. She looked up at him. "Someone set me up," she said. The words came out quietly, without drama, with the flat certainty of someone who had just completed an equation and didn't like the answer. "Yes," he said. "They built me a contact list I didn't know was compromised." Her jaw was tight. "They knew I'd be calling those numbers. They knew it would look like..." It looked like exactly what they needed it to look like. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, then, the coat. You noticed. I noticed you looking at it when you came in. She had both hands flat on the table, not shaking, not visibly shaking. Someone borrowed my coat. Someone who had access to the east corridor, which is... She stopped. That's most of the house. It is. She breathed, in and out, controlled, the way she did everything. Are we in danger? She said. She did not look at Zuri when she said it. She kept her eyes on him. But the question was entirely about the child. He looked at her. He thought about what was in motion in Incheon and Busan, about Song Do-hyun in the East Corridor with two unarmed men waiting on a relay to Daegu, about Ryo and Han and Min and the specific timeline of 2 hours that he did not actually have 2 hours to resolve. Not yet, he said. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not. She looked at Zuri. The child was drawing something with a blue crayon. A butterfly. Always a butterfly. The specific shape of it recognizable from 6 feet away by now. She was completely absorbed in it. She was going to look up in approximately 40 seconds and show it to someone. Tell me what you need, Naomi said. He looked at her. I know what I'm sitting in the middle of, she said, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. I know this isn't... I'm not stupid about what this place is, or what you are, or what that conversation in the library was about. I know. She held his eyes. Tell me what you need from us. He had not expected that. He had expected fear, or bargaining, or the calculation of someone trying to determine the exit. Not this. Not the specific quality of someone who had assessed the situation fully and arrived at an offer. He looked at her for a moment. Stay in this room, he said. Keep her calm. Don't tell her anything is wrong. She already knows something's wrong. She's 3. She's not just 3, Naomi said quietly. He stood up. He looked at Zuri, who had just finished the butterfly and was holding it up to examine it with the critical assessment of someone who knew their own standards. The butterfly was orange and black and slightly asymmetrical, exactly like every other butterfly she painted, exactly like the one that was still, faded now but present, in the photograph on his phone that he had not told anyone he had taken on the morning this all began. Done, Zuri announced. She looked around the kitchen. She looked at her mother. She looked at Tae-hyun. She held it out to him. For you, she said. You look like you need one. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Tae-hyun looked at the painting in her hand, at her face, at the complete uncomplicated certainty with which she decided that a butterfly was what the situation required and had provided it. He took it. He didn't say anything. He took it, and he looked at it, and he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and then he looked at Naomi, and she was looking back at him with something in her eyes that he did not have time for, and that he was going to have to carry anyway. Lock the door after me, he said. He went back out into the corridor. Whoa. The next 40 minutes were the most precise of his life. He reached Choi Jae-min at 8:10, not by phone, by direct contact, face-to-face, because this conversation could not be on a line. Jae-min was at the Seoul relay point by 8:20 with 4 additional men that Tae-hyun trusted with the specific trust of people who had been tested and had passed. He reached the legal team at 8:15 and gave them instructions that had nothing to do with the Daegu proposal and everything to do with a separate set of documents that he had been preparing for 3 weeks in a different context for a different reason, and which were now going to serve a purpose he hadn't anticipated. He reached a man in the National Police Agency at 8:22, a man who had been on his payroll for 9 years, and who had therefore accumulated 9 years' worth of reason to ensure their arrangement remained mutually beneficial. He asked for one specific thing, one operation, targeted, documented, clean. He told the man where Song Do-hyun was. He told him about the service entrance breach and the fraudulent access card and the 2 armed men in his east corridor. He gave the man everything he needed to make an arrest that would hold. This was the card he burned. The most expensive card in the deck. 9 years of careful management of a relationship that he would never be able to use in quite the same way again, because you only called this in once, and after once, the dynamic shifted permanently. He burned it. At 8:40, he walked back into the east corridor where Song Do-hyun was waiting with his two unarmed men, and he said, "Daegu's answer is no." Song stiffened. "You haven't heard the—" "I don't need to hear it. You tell them. The Jong-il Syndicate does not negotiate with people standing inside its house without an invitation. They want a table conversation. They do it through proper channels on neutral ground. They want to hold Incheon and Busan and see what happens next." Tae-hyun stopped, looked at Song directly. "Then we find out." "You're making a mistake," Song said, and for the first time the professional register cracked slightly, just slightly, and underneath it was the voice of a man who had not expected this and who was running the new arithmetic as fast as he could. "Maybe," Tae-hyun said, "but it's mine to make." He turned to the two guards at the corridor entry. "Escort them out. Service entrance." His phone moved in his pocket. He read the message from Dong-soo without changing his expression. "Incheon. Our men pushed back. Rio's people are withdrawing. Busan? Same." Not because Rio and Han had changed their minds, because Choi Jae-min's people had arrived at the relay points and the math on the ground had shifted, and Rio and Han's people, who were foot soldiers, not strategists, had looked at the new math and made the only rational calculation available to them. He put the phone away. Outside, through the north-facing window at the corridor's end, he heard the sound of vehicles, two of them, arriving fast at the front gate. Unmarked, but the model and the movement pattern were things he recognized. National Police Agency. Song Do-hyun heard it too. He stopped walking. Tae-hyun looked at him. "Service entrance," he said again. "Now. You might make it. You might." Song looked at him with an expression that was equal parts fury and something that might, in a different context, have been grudging recognition. He turned and moved, and his two men moved with him, and Tae-hyun watched them go and felt the particular cold satisfaction of a move that had cost everything it was worth and not a single thing more. The vehicles reached the gate. He had 30 seconds, maybe 40, before this became a different kind of problem. The kind that involved official personnel in his house, asking questions, requiring responses, generating records that would take months to manage back to neutral. He walked fast to the kitchen wing. The guard outside the kitchen door looked at him and stepped aside without being asked. Tae-hyun knocked twice. A pause. Then Naomi's voice, very controlled, "Yes." "Open the door." The door opened. She was right there, just behind it, with Zuri at her side holding Gerald the elephant and looking at Tae-hyun with those direct, uncomplicated eyes. "There are police at the gate," he said. "They're here for Song, not for this house. But they'll want to come inside, and I can't—" He stopped, restructured. "I need you and Zuri in the east guest room, now. You didn't see anything this morning. You were in your room. You heard nothing." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Go. Fast." She took Zuri's hand and moved, and Zuri went with her without complaint, carrying Gerald under one arm, and as they passed him in the doorway, Zuri looked up at Tae-hyun and said with perfect seriousness, "Is everything going to be okay?" He looked down at the 3-year-old. He had the butterfly in his inside pocket. He could feel it there against his chest, folded paper, watercolor orange and black. The weight of it, approximately nothing. The weight of it, yes, Tae-hyun said. He said it to a 3-year-old holding a gray stuffed elephant in the corridor of a house that had armed police arriving at its front gate and an organization in open fracture at its eastern edges. And he said it without calculation, without strategy, without the layer of performance he put between himself and everything else. He just said it. Zuri looked at him for one more second with those eyes that had no armor in them anywhere, and then she nodded. Seriously, the way she accepted information she had decided to trust. And she turned and walked down the corridor beside her mother, and Naomi did not look back. And Tae-hyun stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them go and felt the butterfly against his chest and breathed. Then he turned and went to meet the police. The NPA officers were 2 of them, plain clothes, with the particular quality of men who had been doing this long enough that the work had settled into them and made them economical. No wasted movement, no performance of authority, the authority simply present in the way they occupied space. The senior one was a man named Lieutenant Woo Sung-jae, whom Tae-hyun had never met directly, but whose name he knew from the files his contact maintained. Wu had a reputation for being clean, which was a problem, and also, in this specific context, an asset. A clean officer given specific, accurate intelligence about a service entrance breach and an armed trespass had a clear operational mandate. He did not need to ask complicated questions about why someone had broken into the Kang estate. He needed to process the breach as presented. Taehyun met them in the entry hall and was exactly what he needed to be. Cooperative, measured, the victim of a trespass rather than a man whose organization had just survived an internal fracture and a cartel maneuver in the same morning. He gave them Song Do-hyun's name. He gave them the service entrance card. He gave them the camera footage from the utility corridor that showed 3 men entering without authorization at 6:40 a.m. He did not give them anything else, and he did not need to, because the case for trespass and unlawful entry was clean and complete and required nothing further. Wu listened, took notes, moved through the east corridor with his partner, examined the entry point, reviewed the footage on the laptop that Dong-soo provided. He was thorough, and he was fast, and in 40 minutes he was done. At the door, he stopped. He looked at Tae-hyun for a moment with the eyes of a man who understood that what he was standing inside of was considerably larger than a trespass case and had decided, for reasons that were his own, to stay within the lane he'd been given. "Mr. Kang," he said, "we'll follow up if we have additional questions." "Of course," Tae-hyun said. Wu left. The gate closed. Tae-hyun stood in the entry hall and let the silence of the house settle back around him like something returning to its natural state after being disturbed, and he felt the exhaustion arrive in full. The specific, total exhaustion of a man who had been running at maximum intensity for 17 continuous hours, and had now, for the first time, nothing immediately requiring that intensity. He sat down on the bench in the entry hall. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He sat there for 4 minutes, which was the first time in 12 years he had sat somewhere without working. The reckoning with Ryu and Han took 3 days. Not the operational reckoning. That was faster. By noon on the first day, Choi Jae-min had confirmed the withdrawal from both Incheon and Busan, the assessment of damage to both operations, and the identification of the 12 men in Ryo and Han's respective networks who had known about the plan and participated in it. Those 12 men were handled with the kind of systematic efficiency that Tae-hyun had always been known for. Removed from their positions, their access terminated, their severance calculated precisely to communicate that he was not punishing failure of loyalty with death, but that the cost of it was comprehensive and permanent. 3 of them were referred to the police via his contact with information that was accurate and documented. He was not interested in performing brutality for its own sake. He was interested in making the structure of consequences so clear that no one in the remaining organization had ambiguity about where the lines were. Ryo Sung-bai was brought to the estate on the 2nd day. He came with 2 of his own men, which Tae-hyun allowed. He was 52 years old, and he had been with the organization for 9 years, and he was not stupid. He knew what the withdrawal from Incheon meant. He knew that the Daegu play had failed. He knew that he was sitting across a table from a man who had every justification and every means to make the next hour the last hour of his life. He sat across the table in the consultation room with his hands folded and his face arranged in the particular composure of a man who had made a bet and lost it and was now waiting to find out the specific price. Tae-hyun looked at him. "Tell me who approached you first," he said. "Not Min, not Song. The original contact. The person who told you Daegu was interested." Ryo told him. The name was Park Hyung-seo, a mid-level Daegu asset, talent scouter type, who had been working the margins of the Eastern Network for 8 months, long enough to identify the specific grievances that Ryo and Han were carrying, to understand the territorial resentment the Park Treaty had created, and to offer it a direction. 8 months. The Daegu cartel had been running this operation for 8 months, with patience and precision, and at no point in those 8 months had Tae-hyun seen it coming, and the reason he hadn't seen it coming was sitting in the East guest room with a 3-year-old and a stuffed elephant. Not Naomi. Not directly. But the aperture she'd walked through, the aperture he had let open, was the aperture that had made the rest of it possible. When you started leaving your office door open, other things opened too. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Ryu. "The Western Corridor," Tae-hyun said. "The distribution points you were going to lose under the park terms. I'll give you the Ansan alternative route instead. It's longer, but the margin is better. Ryo went very still. In exchange, Taehyun said, you're going to bring me everything you gave Daegu. Every conversation, every document, every piece of organizational intelligence you passed. All of it. And your operational autonomy in the Northwest gets restructured, reporting directly to Dong-soo on a monthly cycle for 2 years. Ryu stared at him. That's the offer, Taehyun said. It expires when you walk out of this room. He was not being merciful. He was being strategic, and there was a difference, and Ryu was experienced enough to understand the difference. Destroying Ryu created a power vacuum in the Northwest that would cost more to manage than it cost to restructure. Keeping him under tighter architecture with a grievance addressed was more efficient than replacing him with an unknown. This was not forgiveness, it was calculation. Ryo understood this. He nodded. Yes, he said. Han Sung-woo came the following morning, and the conversation was nearly identical and ended the same way. Min Jun-ho came in the afternoon. Min was different. Min sat across the table, and his hands were not folded. They were flat, and there was a quality to his stillness that was less composed acceptance and more the stillness of a man who was still running options, still calculating, still looking for the angle he hadn't found yet. Taehyun looked at him for a long moment. You came to my house, he said, last Friday. You sat in my consultation room and you gave me names, Ryo, Han, and you framed it as concern. You said you were bringing me information because it was your responsibility. Min said nothing. That was the read, Taehyun said. You came to see how much I knew. You came to assess whether the operation was compromised. And you gave me Ryu and Han because if I moved on them, the Daegu timeline accelerated and you had plausible distance from the outcome either way. Min's face did not change. Here's what I can't fully determine, Taehyun said. Whether you were Daegu's man from the beginning, or whether you were running your own play, use Daegu's leverage to push out Ryo and Han, consolidate their territories under yours, and emerge from the whole thing clean. He paused. Either way, the answer is the same. But I'd like to know which one it is. Min looked at him. The calculation in his face shifted very slightly, something settling, something that had been running a last set of numbers and had arrived at a final answer. Both, Min said, at different times. At least it was honest. Then you know there's no version of this where you stay, Taehyun said. Min breathed. One breath, measured. I know. The Cheju offer stands. You retire. You keep the assets you've legitimately accumulated. You don't contact anyone in this organization, you don't do business in any sector that touches our operations, and if the Daegu family reaches out to you again, you contact Dong-soo within 24 hours. He looked at Min steadily. Break any of those conditions, and the calculation changes completely. Min was quiet for a moment, then, generous. It's not, Taehyun said. It's the arrangement that creates the least ongoing cost. Don't mistake efficiency for generosity. Min nodded once. He stood. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and did not turn around. For what it's worth, Min said, I don't think you have a blind spot anymore. He left. Taehyun sat alone in the consultation room and stared at the table and thought about how much things that were worth nothing still cost. He found Naomi on the 4th day. The house had returned to its operational rhythm, adjusted, restructured, with new reporting lines and a security architecture that had been rebuilt from the service entrance up, but recognizable. Dong-soo moved through it with his usual controlled efficiency. The guards ran their rotations. The household functioned. Naomi was in the west sitting room, not working. It was late afternoon after her scheduled hours, the soft gray December light coming in flat through the windows. She was sitting in the chair she always used, the one angled toward the low table where Zuri worked, but Zuri was not there. Zuri was at the apartment. The past 4 days had been normal working days, normal arrangements. The childcare situation having stabilized with a new arrangement that Taehyun had quietly ensured was funded at a level that meant it would not fall through without warning again. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. She had known, he thought, that this conversation was coming. She had been managing the space between them for 4 days with the precise professional correctness of someone who had decided to give him room to resolve whatever needed resolving before they addressed the rest of it. And he had been grateful for that. And he had also been aware of it as a kind of sustained tension that had not dissipated regardless of everything else that was resolving around it. He came in and sat down in the chair across from hers. He looked at the low table, the watercolor tin, the wooden crayon case, the thick pad of paper with its current project left half-finished. A forest, animals, a green elephant with a friend beside it, purple and small. "The woman at the job fair," he said. "Park Ji-eun. We found her." Naomi's hand stilled in her lap. Real name Seo Mi Rai. Daegu asset, recruited 4 years ago for exactly this kind of approach, building clean pipelines into target organizations through domestic placement. She identified you 8 months ago when you were still working your first Seoul position. Your background was useful to them. Someone with no connections in Korea, financial pressure that made the placement attractive, a child that made the arrangement sympathetic. He watched her absorb this, watched the specific quality of her face when a thing she'd suspected became confirmed. Not surprise, but a kind of heavy recognition, the weight of being told that the thing you feared was true. "They built you a contact network you didn't know was compromised," he said. "The agency coordinator number, 2 of the administrative numbers you were given for scheduling, all of them traced to Daegu lines. The calls you made were being logged and used to build a pattern that looked like an active intelligence relationship. You were never giving them information because you never had anything to give them. You didn't know anything they needed to know. What they needed was the pattern itself, the appearance. For the footage," she said, "for the footage, for the records. To make the case that the Jong-il syndicate had been infiltrated if the direct operation failed and they needed a backup leverage point." He paused. "You were insurance." She looked at the table. "Your coat," he said. The guest card was registered to a building access level that included the East Corridor storage area. Someone accessed it twice in the 2 weeks before the Mapogu footage. Seomi Ray, we believe, on both occasions. She had the card. She had knowledge of the property layout from the information you'd unconsciously provided through your scheduling calls. Times you arrived, which entrance you used, where you stored your outdoor things. Naomi was quiet for a long moment. "I told them that," she said. Not a question. "You told a scheduling coordinator things a scheduling coordinator would reasonably need to know. That's not a mistake. That's what they were counting on." She looked at the window, at the gray December light. Her hands were in her lap and they were not shaking, but they were not loose either, and he could see the effort of holding everything inside a container that had been under pressure for 4 days. "In Atlanta," she said finally. "Zuri's father, the debt." She stopped. Started again. "He was running numbers for people. Small scale. Or I thought it was small scale. I chose not to look too hard at what I knew, and I told myself that was the same as not knowing." Her voice was level, the kind of level that cost something. "When it fell apart, those people came to me. To our apartment, 3 times. The 3rd time I had Zuri with me, and they—" She stopped. "I left 2 weeks later. I took what I could carry, and I came here because I needed to be somewhere they'd never look." She looked at him. "I have been so careful," she said. "Since I got here. I have been so careful not to bring trouble anywhere near her." He looked at her directly. "I know. I couldn't have known what that woman was. I couldn't have—" "I know," he said again. "Naomi." She stopped. He hadn't planned to use her name. It came out the same way things had been coming out around her for weeks, without the usual architecture around them, bypassing the layer he kept between feeling and expression. "None of this was your fault," he said. "I verified that, completely. There's nothing in the full picture that puts responsibility on you for any part of what happened." She breathed, in and out. He watched the breath move through her and felt the thing in his chest that he had designated a no-access zone, and that had been ignoring that designation since approximately the 4th week of November. "Why are you still here?" she said. Not hostile, just genuine. The question of someone who was trying to understand the full geometry of a situation that kept not being what she'd expected. He considered it. "There's a permanent position," he said. "Not contingent on the childcare situation or the weekly scheduling. A fixed role, full salary, benefits, and living arrangements on the property that give you and Zuri a stable situation regardless of what the job requires on any given day." He stopped. "Those are the terms of the offer." She looked at him. "That's not what I asked," she said. He held her eyes for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." The room was quiet. Outside, the December light was going. The short days dropping into dark fast, the way they did at this latitude in winter. The mountains outside the north windows were already half gone into the early dusk. "I don't know what this is," he said. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said things when there was no point in managing them. "I don't have a vocabulary for it. That's honest." "I don't either," she said. "I know that what this looks like from the outside is—" He stopped, tried again. "The power arrangement is not— I'm aware of what it looks like." "I'm aware of what it looks like too," she said. "I've been aware of it since week 1. She paused. "I'm still here." "You needed the job," he said. Because it had to be said, because the alternative was pretending it wasn't a variable, and he didn't pretend things weren't variables. "I needed the job at week 1, she said. "That's not what's happening at week 8. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the straightforward, unguarded quality that he had first noticed and catalogued, and tried to keep at analytical distance, and which had never once in 8 weeks actually maintained that distance, regardless of how many times he'd required it to. "I'm not a simple situation," he said. "I know what you are," she said. "I've been cleaning your house for 2 months. I know what the locked rooms are for. I know what the late-night meetings mean. I know what the weight you carry looks like on a person." She paused. "I'm not asking for simple. What are you asking for?" She thought about it. Not performing the thought, actually thinking, the way she thought about everything, directly and without evasion. "Honesty," she said finally. "Whatever else this is or isn't, just that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I can do that," he said. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not a promise of transformation or redemption or the particular fantasy of the person whose love changes the dangerous man into something safe. He was not going to become something safe. The organization was not going to dissolve. The locked rooms were going to stay locked, and the weight was going to keep being what it was. And she knew that, and he knew she knew it. What it was honesty. Offered straight, at the cost of the careful distance he'd built over 12 years around the specific aperture that loneliness created. Offered across a low table in a room where a 3-year-old painted butterflies and the light was going gray, and the mountains were disappearing into the early dark. "Okay," she said. 3 weeks later, Tae-hyun converted the unused room at the end of the east corridor. He did it himself, which was, he was aware, a strange choice for a man who ran a criminal syndicate and had a full household staff. He could have given the instruction to Dong-soo or to Naomi or to anyone. Instead, he spent a Saturday morning clearing the room of the storage boxes it had accumulated, moving the furniture that had been staged there against possible use, determining what the space could hold. He ordered the supplies himself. Easels, 3 of them, different heights, the smallest one adjustable down to the level of a 3-year-old. Watercolor sets, not the basic flat tins, but the round well type that held more color and washed more cleanly. Paper in 3 different weights. Crayons in sets of 64, which he'd learned from observation was significantly more important to Zuri than the sets of 16. Books, picture books initially, the kind with illustrations dense enough to study, and 2 books about butterflies with photographs. He painted the walls himself as well. Not professionally, not with any skill. He had never painted walls in his life, and it showed. The edges were imprecise, and the coverage was uneven in places, and Dong-soo, who came to the doorway twice during the process and looked at him with an expression that contained multitudes, said nothing on either occasion, which Tae-hyun would remember as one of the more graceful things Dong-soo had ever done. The color was yellow. Not sharp yellow, not the aggressive yellow of warning signs, but the soft yellow of afternoon light in a room that faced south. The color that made a space feel warmer than it was. The color that Zuri used for the sun in every single painting she made. He finished on a Sunday afternoon and stepped back and looked at it. Imperfect, slightly uneven, exactly the color he'd intended. And felt something that he was not going to examine too closely because it was sufficient to feel it without naming it. He did not tell Naomi what he'd done. He did not tell Zuri. On Monday morning, Naomi arrived and went through her usual routine, and at no point during the morning did she open the door at the end of the east corridor, because it was a storage room that she had no reason to enter. At 11 in the morning, Taehyun appeared in the doorway of the west sitting room, where Zuri was at work on an ambitious project involving an entire city populated by animals and clothing. He stood there until she looked up. "Come with me," he said. She put down her crayon with the seriousness of someone marking a pause in important work, and she climbed down from her chair, and she took Gerald the elephant from the table and tucked him under her arm, and she came. He walked her down the east corridor. Naomi was somewhere in the house. He heard her in the kitchen, the small sounds of organized work, and did not come out as they passed. He stopped at the door at the end of the corridor. He looked down at Zuri. She was looking at the door with the particular focused attention of a child who had just registered that something was different about a door she'd walked past before, that it was painted, that the paint was yellow at the frame's edge. He opened it. She looked inside. She stood in the doorway and looked at the yellow walls and the 3 easels, and the supplies arranged on the long table and the books on the shelf and the photographs of butterflies. Monarchs, specifically. Because he had looked it up, and monarchs were what she'd told him about the first time she'd shown him a painting, the ones that flew all the way to Mexico, that was really far, pinned along the south wall at her eye level. She didn't move. He waited. "Is this mine?" she said. The words came out quiet. Not the demanding ownership of a child accustomed to having things, but the specific disbelief of someone encountering something they hadn't known to expect. "It's for the butterflies," he said. She looked at the room for another moment. Then she looked at him, and her face, that face that had no armor in it, that had never once in the months he'd known her calibrated itself to the temperature of a room or to what he expected from it, was doing something that he felt in the back of his throat. She crossed the threshold. She went to the smallest easel and looked at it, ran her hand along the wood with the careful reverence of someone touching something that belonged to them. She looked at the watercolor sets, opened one, studied the colors with focused intensity. She went to the butterfly photographs and stood in front of them for a long time. Then she turned around and crossed the room and wrapped both arms around his legs and held on with the complete, unself-conscious commitment of a child who had decided this was what the moment required. He stood there. He did not move immediately. Then, slowly, he put one hand on the back of her head, light, careful, the hand of a man who had not done this in a very long time and was having to remember how. And he held it there. Behind him in the corridor, he heard footsteps stop. He looked up. Naomi was standing at the doorway of the yellow room with one hand against the frame, and she was looking at the room, and at her daughter, and at him, and her face. The face that was always composed, always managed, the face of a woman who had spent 1.5 years holding everything together through will alone, was not fully composed right now. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He had not wept in a very long time. He was not weeping now. But something behind his eyes was doing something that he was not going to examine in the corridor of his own house on a Monday morning, and he let it do it anyway because it was already happening and the stopping of it was not available to him. "Thank you," Naomi said, just that. "It needed a purpose," he said. She looked at the room, at the yellow walls, imprecise at the edges, at the photographs of monarchs along the south wall, at a 3-year-old's eye level. Her hand moved at her side, and then she stopped it, and then she let it do what it was going to do, which was to reach out and touch his arm once, briefly, with the specific quality of contact that did not require any further definition. He looked at her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own. Inside the yellow room, Zuri had climbed onto the stool in front of the smallest easel and was already opening a watercolor tin with the focused urgency of someone who had been waiting their whole life for exactly this surface and this light. "What are you going to paint first?" Naomi said from the doorway. Zuri considered the colors seriously. She selected orange. She selected black. She dipped her brush. "Butterflies," she said, "the way you said something obvious, something that had always been true and would keep being true. Always butterflies." Look, it was December when the room was finished, and January when the Eastern operations were fully restructured, and February when the last of the Daegu matter was formally closed. Not with violence, not with the scorched earth response that some of his people had expected, but with a negotiation conducted on his terms at a neutral table in Busan, where he sat across from 2 Daegu representatives and outlined the specific consequences of any further attempts to penetrate his organization. The consequences were comprehensive and credible, and both representatives understood them completely. The meeting lasted 90 minutes and ended with a document that was not a treaty and not a threat, but something in between. The formal notation of a mutual understanding about where the lines were. He drove back to the estate in the late afternoon, the road through the mountains going dark at the edges where the tree line cut off the last of the winter light. He thought about Lee Byung-chul on the way back. 9 years, a daughter in Busan, a quiet, desperate attempt to take a little more than he'd been given. He thought about what the man had been hungry for, and whether the hunger had a name, and whether the name was anything as simple as money. He thought about Min Jun-ho in Jeju by now, beginning whatever retirement looked like for a man who had spent 30 years in this world. He thought about Ryu and Han running their territories under the new reporting structure, probably resentful, definitely careful, possibly, over time, becoming something more reliable than they'd been when they thought the cost of disloyalty was manageable. He thought about the butterfly in his inside jacket pocket. Not the same one. That one was at the estate, placed between 2 sheets of glass in a simple frame on the desk in his office, because he had done that quietly one afternoon and had not told anyone and did not intend to. But there was always another one. Zuri painted one for him approximately twice a week, with the systematic generosity of someone who had identified a need and was committed to meeting it indefinitely. He pulled through the gate. The east-facing windows of the estate were lit warm from inside. The household running its evening, Naomi finishing her day, Zuri probably in the yellow room in the last half hour before her bedtime routine. The mountains behind the property were gone into the dark completely, the way they always were by this hour in winter, and the rain that had been threatening all day had started. Soft, not the hard pounding of November, just the steady quiet presence of winter rain on the roof and the stone. He sat in the car for a moment after the engine stopped. He thought about what the estate had sounded like a year ago. The specific quality of the silence, managed, precise, the silence of a place designed to suppress the variables that silence usually contained. No humming, no small voice discussing the biographical history of stuffed animals. No laughter from rooms he was not inside. He thought about what it sounded like now. He got out of the car. Dong-soo met him at the door with the daily briefing, which Tae-hyun listened to standing in the entry hall while he took off his coat, and which contained nothing that required immediate action. The Busan operations clean, the Incheon numbers stabilizing, a routine compliance issue in the construction firm that the legal team had already flagged and addressed. "Anything else?" Tae-hyun said. Dong-soo paused. "Zuri," Dong-soo said, "has produced 14 butterflies today. I've been asked to inform you that 6 of them are for you specifically, and the other 8 are for the mansion generally." Tae-hyun looked at him. Dong-soo's face maintained its studied 12-year composure, with the single exception of a slight movement at the corner of his mouth that could, in adequate lighting, have been identified as the distant relation of a smile. "Tell her I received the information," Tae-hyun said. He walked down the corridor toward the east wing. At the yellow room, he stopped in the doorway. Zuri was at the smallest easel, working with the brush in both hands the way she did sometimes when the project was complicated. The room smelled of paint and the slightly sweet, warm smell of a heated space that a child had occupied all day. The butterfly photographs were still along the south wall, but there were additions now. Her own work, the best ones, pinned up beside the photographs with the critical self-assessment of an artist who knew which pieces deserved display. She had not heard him come in. She was completely absorbed. He watched her for a moment. The small, serious figure in the yellow room, the light warm around her, painting with the focused commitment of someone who understood that butterflies were important work and did not require justification. He thought about what she'd said the morning everything collapsed and came back together. When he'd told her things were going to be okay, and she'd looked at him with those eyes that had no armor anywhere in them, and she'd accepted it and moved on. The capacity for that. For trust offered plainly, without protection, to a man who had given her no guarantee he could back it up, except that she'd looked at him and decided. The specificity of that. The cost and the courage of it in a child who had come into the world already understanding that some promises were not kept. He knocked softly on the doorframe. She looked up. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. "I made you 6 today," she said. "Dong-soo was supposed to tell you." "He told me." "Which one do you want?" She gestured at the finished ones laid out along the table to dry. 6 butterflies in various color combinations, each one slightly different, each one painted with her characteristic mixture of anatomical seriousness and complete chromatic freedom. You can pick. He looked at them. He crossed the room and crouched down so he was at her level, which was something he'd been doing without thinking about it for the last several weeks, adjusting his height to hers in a way that his body had learned without being instructed. And he looked at the 6 butterflies laid out before him. One of them was orange and black. Monarch. Precise wing pattern, better than the early ones. She'd been studying the photographs. The wings were still slightly asymmetrical, which he now knew was anatomically accurate rather than a limitation. This one, he said. She nodded, satisfied. That's the best one. I thought you'd pick that one. He picked it up carefully. He looked at it. Behind him, he heard Naomi come to the doorway. He knew her step now, the specific weight and rhythm of it. And stop. And he heard the quality of her stopping, which was the quality of someone content to be in a doorway without requiring entry, watching something that was complete as it was. He stayed crouched at Zuri's level with the butterfly in his hand, and looked at the monarch wings and felt the weight of the year, the exhaustion and the fractures and the cost of every decision that had brought him from the night of Lee Byung-chul's death to this yellow room on a February evening, settle through him and find somewhere to rest. Not resolution, not the clean simplicity of a man made whole by the right circumstances. He was not made whole. He was the same man. The organization was the same organization. The locked rooms still locked. The weight still the weight. The machinery of his world still running with its usual comprehensive indifference to the softer categories of human experience. But the door was open. Not the office door, though that was open too. Something else. The particular door that a man builds across the part of himself that has been hurt too many times to risk again, and which he maintains with such consistent care that eventually he forgets the door is not the wall. That there is still something behind it worth protecting, something that has not been destroyed by everything that has happened, something that is still, incredibly, capable of being reached. A 3-year-old with the paintbrush had found it. She hadn't knocked. She hadn't asked permission. She had simply painted it, butterflies and sunshine and a small pink flower. And the door had become a painting, and the painting had made him laugh for the first time in 4 years, and that had been the beginning of the end of the door. He looked at the monarch butterfly in his hand. It's perfect, he said. Zuri looked at him with the direct, complete attention that was entirely hers. I know, she said simply, the way you said something true. He stood up. He turned and looked at Naomi in the doorway, her face in the warm yellow light of the room, the quiet steadiness of her, the particular quality of her presence that he had been trying since October to keep at a distance that no longer existed. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Outside, the February rain came down soft and steady on the stone of the estate and on the mountain ridge where the clouds were low and the peaks were invisible, the way they had been the very first morning she had walked through his gate in her gray coat and her sensible shoes, carrying a life she was rebuilding with both hands. The mountains were still there. They were just resting for a while, in the dark. And in the yellow room on the east corridor of the most feared crime lord in South Korea, a 3-year-old picked up her brush and painted another butterfly. Because there were always more butterflies, there was always more color, and the world, as far as she had ever been able to tell, contained an inexhaustible supply of people who needed both.